I'm Scott Kominers, and I'm very excited to be speaking to you about market design perspectives on inequality. I should say this is a lecture that usually comes towards the end of the summer school, in some sense because market design is integrative. It's about thinking about economics as a tool for engineering. And today in particular, we're going to be trying to understand a little bit about what it's like to think about economics that way, and then how to take that way of thinking about the field and bring it to socioeconomic inequality applications. As it is, because of a bunch of different chaoses of scheduling, we're at the very beginning instead of towards the end. So please keep all of these thoughts in mind and use them to prime your ability to go look for engineering solutions and tools as you build out your toolkit over the rest of this week. So talk is divided into two parts. The first of which is going to be predominantly talk. We're going to learn a little bit about how one thinks about market design. I'll walk you through several different cuts and interpretations of what I call the market design approach. Market designers call, and this is just how I choose to interpret and organize it. Then we're going to go through one very detailed example, the context of the Boston Public School match, thinking about how to change the market clearing mechanism to eliminate inequality in access to the system itself, sort of reducing gains from strategic sophistication, or equivalently reducing the importance of strategic inequality in the mechanism. And then at the end of the first half, we'll talk about a typology and sort of classification or attempted classification of some different ways in which you can use market design to think about inequality. Later on, we'll go through a whole bunch of different case studies trying to build out that typology in actual detail and create a sense of what it's like. All right, any questions about the roadmap? Very good. Well, let's talk. So the market design approach. Market design, I'm going to give you several different definitions, but in some sense, the most primordial of them to me is that the market design is the application of economic principles and game theory to the design or redesign of market institutions. It's using economics and economic ideas and analysis, and this is economics writ broad. We also draw in ideas from sociology, from computer science, from everything that sort of intersects in the nexus of economics, to try and rebuild markets and marketplaces to make them better, where better will be according to welfare metrics we'll superimpose in a bit. What's the actual goal? We're trying to solve real-world problems. So it's, in some sense, it's the translational step of economics. We understand a lot about the world. Economics is predominantly a descriptive science, right? We spend a lot of time trying to understand how individual markets work, what's wrong with them, what they do well, what the causes of the successes or failures of individual markets and marketplaces are. In my view, as soon as you take all of those insights and start trying to use them to fix the marketplace, to fix market failures, to make the market work better, suddenly you become a market designer. You're now translating everything we've learned from economics. So really, it's sort of a pipeline. It sort of involves all these different stages. You start with theory. You then take the theory to practice, and then there's still a very important role of the market designer to come back and evaluate. And in fact, of course, this is sort of not just a uniform, straight line pipeline. The evaluation feeds back both sometimes into new practical interventions. Maybe the type of redesign you didn't work because of something that's just a practical engineering fix, or maybe you actually discover there's more going on than you thought before, and you have to go and build novel theory again. So market design really is like one of these golden spirals, very appropriate for the Center for the Economics of Human Development. This is the logo rotated, so that it matches up with the canonical Fibonacci diagram. No? Everyone awake? Very good. And of course, if you're going to be if you're going to be doing market design, one also thinks of this as something that has not just, infinite degrees of refraction and specificity, but also sort of at every stage along the chain, there's really like a rabbit hole or a chamber of more thinking to do. Often just understanding one market detail is a massive undertaking. And then figuring out, which detail is the linchpin or the rate limiting step is another big one. And then, building the fix, and eventually you sort of get all the way down into this, this infinity range. Okay, so enough fancy pictures, a few more words, and then let's do an application. What does it mean in practice? What are we actually doing? When we do market design, we are often directly re-engineering marketplaces. A big one in the example we'll see in a few minutes is improving incentives. We're actually trying to level the playing field to make everyone equally able to access the system. Another thing that we're often doing, so mechanism design is one of the sort of big foundational pools from which we pull our ideas about how to design marketplaces. But mechanism design has not only incredible positive results, but a wealth of negative results. Sort of almost everything you'd like to be able to do in your market, you can't quite achieve. And if you're writing a paper in the theory of mechanism design, that's a exciting and complete finding in and of itself. But if you're in the real world and you actually have to work in a market, that's only a starting point. So we have to figure out how to work around the impossibility results, where you sort of mix the different design goals together to get something that you actually can achieve. Not to mention doing all of this within the existing conditions. People who organize the markets often have views about how they should run. And those often are superimposed and are fixed constraints. You can maybe push up against them. You can maybe convince them to relax a couple of them. But many of them are just rules that additionally constrain the types of design you can do. But what's the benefit? Once you organize market function, first of all, outcomes are better, assuming you've done your job correctly. Again, better being here under an umbrella welfare function that you pick application by application. But also all sorts of other great stuff happens. So for example, if you improve the incentives enough to make your mechanism strategy-proof, making it optimal for everyone to submit their true information to the system, then as a bonus, you get accurate data that you can use to evaluate features of the system. Right? If you actually learn which schools people want to go to, you can then try and understand what drives their preferences over schools. And so there are sort of benefits. We're used to thinking that markets run well and that at least a well-functioning market is a good thing. There are benefits beyond just sort of the pure functioning of the market that come from having an organized market, in part that allow us to do other economics. So, very good. Key concepts you'll be seeing in and out throughout the entirety of the lectures today. Strategy proofness, I just mentioned. This is the idea that the mechanism incentivizes truthful revelation of preferences or types. It's a good benchmark for simplicity. This is a very easy, if a mechanism is strategy proof, the strategies are very easy for people to play. They just figure out their own preferences and state them. But it's not always achievable. Thickness, a second big issue, is that sometimes you have a market and people just don't show up. Maybe they don't show up because they think they can do better outside. Maybe they don't show up because they actually can do better outside. These are very different states of the world. Whatever the case, if you intend to actually help your market run better, one thing that's really important is ensuring that all of the participants, or at least the ideal set of participants, is actually present. Sorry for branching my grammar in that sense. Another thing that we care about then, once we're at the ground, trying to solve an actual real-world market failure, we care a lot about details in a way that we don't always have to when we're doing economic analysis. Right here, sometimes fine and specific details of the problem in the actual market environment are exactly what drives the market failure. Often we assume away transaction costs. We take a sort of Coasian view of the world. Here, not only can we not get away with assuming away the transaction costs, we actually care about what types of transaction costs exist, because we might want to directly mitigate them. And then, very important, and I can't emphasize this one enough, somehow, in the midst of all of this other maelstrom, we have to come up with solutions that are flexible enough to be used. Have to be used sort of in the eyes of policymakers, who are the ones who actually implement the decisions, policymakers, whether in government or within companies, and flexible enough that there's still some generality that you can sort of extract out and understand what is and is not similar between different markets and how solutions from one might help another. Yes?
Where do you put understandability of the mechanism in this? Is that under flexibility? It seems like that could very well trade off with strategy.
Yeah. So the question is, where do I put understandability, making it clear to people what's actually going on? That runs throughout all of these different bits. So there are mechanisms that are strategy-proof, but that are so hard to explain to people that they don't actually believe it. And so they refuse to behave, or they, in practice, do not seem to behave as if the mechanism, as if they understand that the mechanism is strategy-proof. There are all these stories recently, even in markets with sophisticated players, or relatively sophisticated players. There are stories about doctors in the medical residency match trying to game the system, even though it's strategy-proof and in large sense immune to gaming, because they're under the impression that this is a thing that can be gamed, and it's a big scary thing that determines a lot of their lives going forward. And so you put a lot of attention into it, and if you think about it hard enough, maybe you think, aha, I get it, this works, I'm fine. And maybe if you think about it enough, you start running in circles and banging your head against the wall, and eventually lie about your preferences in a way that might eventually hurt you. So first of all, up there. Second of all, market thickness. Lots of people stay away from markets because they don't understand how the market works, because it's a scary black box. Think about people who don't participate in the banking system, for example. This whole issue is perhaps one of the many details we have to care about. You think very differently about how you design markets for billion-dollar wireless spectrum auctions to telecoms, where every company is going to hire multiple consultants to help them sort through their decision, from the way you think about how you might design systems for allocating food to food banks. Even though in practice, sort of both of them are kind of similar, right? You have some commodities, you have a bunch of players, you're trying to allocate the commodities to the players, but one set of players are very sophisticated, very well-funded companies playing a one-shot interaction that is a multi-billion-dollar decision for themselves. The other is lots of small players, often run by people who entered into the system because they wanted to fight inequalities and inequities outside the system, and who are perhaps not excited about, thus not excited about or able to hire high-paid consultants to tell them how to bid daily for food. You choose very different design solutions in both. We won't talk about spectrum auctions anymore over the course of this lecture, but we will come back to the food banks at the end. Very good. More questions on this slide. This is actually a good place to collect queries if there are any. Yeah?
Like incomplete information or just behavioral models about how rational people are when they actually make their decisions?
Yeah, so in a second I'll show you a very coarse behavioral model of the Boston Public School match. In general, here there are some fuzzinesses. So there aren't many people who have so far figured out how to take behavioral economics ideas into the world of market design in a lot of depth. Both of these have sort of been evolving tremendously over the past 15, 20 years. And we're now in the last 3 or 4 maybe starting to see them intersect more. But this is a huge area for the future. Again, especially relevant towards inequality applications. Most of the worlds we think about, there is some degree, there is at least some degree of information imperfection that we hope the market is going to at least mitigate somehow. But we don't, I think, the models I'm going to talk about today, to the extent that I'm going to show you formal models, they have very sort of naive information structures. This is this is not a good endpoint for the field, yeah, and I think there is becoming more and more of this stuff that's done in sort of more realistic information environments, but we don't yet understand exactly what the transition to more realistic information environments will mean. It's a great question. Please write papers on this and come back and talk in 3 years, 4 years, whatever. More questions? All right. So we now pass from the extremely broad overview of market design. I promise we'll come back and rehearse that again once we understand what it actually means, to the promised example from school choice. Yeah?
I actually do have a question. So
Yeah.
whenever we're looking at designing a market, if it's possible to make the market, I guess, quote unquote, better, I guess I'll use Pareto,
Yep.
Pareto efficient Why would it be the case that we haven't already made that Pareto efficient move and we need an economist to come in and
Great question.
make a market that does allow us to make that Pareto move?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question and a particularly appropriate one here at Chicago, right? Like, the question is, let's say Pareto efficiency is our desideratum. Why hasn't the market already gotten there, right? Like, in principle, we think it should, or at least we hope. I mentioned one example earlier, which is this sort of, fuzz of transaction costs, right? It's often the case that markets fail to achieve fully efficient outcomes simply because, some transactions are impossible due to communication costs or transport costs or information and so forth. But there's more to it than that, right? So there's a sense in which the frictionless market model is like the physics ideal. And a lot of the analysis we do in economics works in the world of that physics ideal, possibly with like individual widgets or gadgets attached. Like we might, impose hyperbolic discounting on top of a physics ideal model and try and understand what hyperbolic discounting does to people's behavior in the market. But practical markets have all sorts of funny features. So in the second half, we'll talk about a labor market example where we have a big, in principle, frictionless online labor market, right? So you think about like your Odesks or your Elances, or even like the more advanced ones for software engineers. You have a big frictionless labor market on the internet. In principle, anyone from anywhere can sign up to provide labor. Anyone from anywhere can sign up to solicit, employees. But somehow, the search costs are huge. Finding any individual employee to do your task is very, very difficult. And the setup costs are also very large. So, lots of people or lots of companies try and start setting up, employment on these online labor platforms and end up exiting before they ever manage to run their first job, simply because setup is hard. Right? These companies invest massive amounts in reducing the transaction costs to getting on the system. Then once you're there, search costs are huge. And it's really hard to identify talent. And if you're a new member of the talent pool, you might be super talented, but if you don't have some way to signal it, you're going to get lost in the shuffle. And so there might be, for example, in the application we'll see, gains to certifying people up front, providing new forms of skill certification that can help them get a leg up on arrival and thicken the talent pool directly, instead of having everyone sort of be completely identical ex ante. And these types of things like make total sense even in a purely sort of like classical economic framework. We've just, all we've added is search and a little bit of imperfect information about people's actual skill and ability types. Does that help? Cool. Yeah?
I have a question about the political dimension here.
Yeah.
The market design. Who are the designers and when it gets to the implementation phase?
Mm-hmm.
And if the market design fails, who's held responsible? The policymakers?
Yeah.
And yeah.
So this is a great stream of questions. So the question is, let's think about the politics for a moment. If you're going to redesign a market, who actually does the redesign? And if it fails, who takes the blame? And there's an implicit other question there, which I alluded to a little bit before, which is sort of whose welfare function are we trying to optimize in the first place, right? Because it's possible that we could build what we see as the economist's most like pristine and elegant solution possible that would be so wildly inappropriate on some basic fairness dimension or something that cause all the policymakers to get kicked out of office, and that wouldn't be a success either. This is very important. So there's a little bit of there's a sense in which I want you to, at least for the purposes of this talk, take the engineering point seriously. We're the engineers. We're called in to help fix the problem, or sometimes, if we want to be entrepreneurial engineers, might spot problems and offer to help fix them for people. But we're trying to run with respect to the policymakers or market organizers' welfare functions to the greatest extent possible. That means that if we succeed, we're helping to achieve their policy goals. And again, this doesn't preclude us from doing all the other things economists do of trying to convince them that maybe they have slightly incorrect policy goals and or helping them interpret and understand what their actual goals are. So we'll see in a moment. But at the end, we're sort of trying to maximize the welfare function that the policymakers or market organizers have set. The downside risk case probably reflects on everybody. We seek and hope at all times to do as good a job as possible. If somehow post-market intervention, things don't get better or even worse, get worse. First of all, just on all of us, we take responsibility for the roles we've had in the problem and should do everything we can to help with the cleanup, conditional on being allowed to do so. Also, probably it reflects poorly on the policymakers or the market organizers, which is a friction and a barrier towards being able to set things up in the first place, right? So if something is going wrong, the potential solution is a big unknown, might involve changing a lot of things. And so it can often be very hard to get in the door because the status quo, even if it's not optimal, is very well understood. And so as we think about the doing of design, we have to be very careful and understand the downside risks, both to the people who are helping us organize the market and to the participants to try and do all of the appropriate risk minimization along the way. Does that? No, it doesn't solve your question at all. What have I missed?
I was just, as you were talking, I began to worry that it seems like economists exercise too much power in society without anyone knowing that. So that whatever you design, you're not designing a market for shoes or something that relates to business transactions. You're designing a market that will impact people's lives. That's so much power to me, and responsibility as well.
Yeah.
And the accountability mechanisms are really fuzzy. Am I overreacting?
So I don't know. I'm not clear on whether the accountability mechanisms are fuzzy. So sorry, so the question, just to restate to make sure everyone heard, this is like a scarily large amount, and please make sure I've stated it correctly. This is a scarily large amount of power for an economist to have, right? Like, we're not just designing commodity markets, we're changing markets that can actually affect people's lives, where they go to school, where they get jobs, how they interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. And that's like a huge amount of power, and also, I guess with great power comes great responsibility. My dean was in the most recent Spider-Man movie. Serious. It's a very, very exciting thing to hear about in the morning when you get into the office. But, lightness aside, that's a lot of power, and it's a lot of responsibility towards the participants and towards the organizers. And then the second part of the question was, and maybe the accountability mechanisms are fuzzy. The economists sweep in. If it's a success, we all have a party, publish a paper, and go home. And if it's a failure, lots of people were hurt, and the economists go home. Yep.
I think an example would help here. So think about the 90s, Russia in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of engineers and economists coming there and sort of supervising reforms.
Mm-hmm.
They called it shock therapy. And everything worked great in theory. It was a disaster in practice. It led to a lot of misery, and I think you can actually connect to the rise of oligarchs. And was everyone held responsible for that? No, no one. And that's like what worries me. I just kept thinking about it.
So I'm unfortunately not an expert in the Russian history example, but it's certainly true, right? That and this is, should be in all of our minds today, right? To the extent that economic policy fails people, it can have really substantial political ramifications down the line, can contribute to and heighten both levels of inequality and sort of sensations of isolation in society as well. The strongest answer I have here, I think, is that we all have to take responsibility and do the best we can to do right, and really own up to it if we screw things up. I can't speak for the I can't speak for the entire profession, although I would hope that would be a role and a goal everywhere. But if you're going to be involved in in any sort of practical economic policy, some amount of practical economic policy is necessary, right? If markets are not achieving socially optimal outcomes, there is value to trying to bring them closer to them. But if you're going to be involved in practical economic policy, you should always, sort of be a fully responsible participant and policymaker, or policy designer, I suppose. Yeah. So, I don't have an answer that will avert complete catastrophe, but hopefully the applications I show you will convince you that there's at least value to be gained, and that if done correctly, there is no catastrophic outcome. All right, we're going to go yeah?
Yeah, I have one last question.
Sure.
So, I'm not a theorist, but to my understanding, I feel like market design is more like designing a centralized system, maximizing the efficiency of the market.
Mm-hmm.
In what way it incorporates the inequality factor, or how does it fit in the general literature of inequality? So I can't connect this to efficiency and inequality sometimes contradicting with each other.
Yeah. So let me clear up a couple of bits of that, and then I think the rest of it should hopefully become clear as we go. So first of all, market design is not just about centralized markets. A lot of the classical applications, and I say classical meaning things within the last 25 years. There's not like there is a history of market design in the Middle Ages and so forth, but we're not touching any of it today. A lot of the classical applications have the property that for whatever reason the design was done in a central and circumscribed circumstance, but that's not a requirement. It's any time you're doing things, and you could be doing them in decentralized markets to try and make the market work, work better and have sort of like more like an economic ideal. But that ideal is with respect to a chosen welfare function. And so in the example we're going to see right now, the principal welfare, or the principal design goal was actually reducing strategic inequality, not a thing that was purely about efficiency. And as you do things that reduce strategic inequality, you can actually move away from efficiency often. Similarly, later, we'll see circumstances where some circumstances where efficiency and reduction in inequality are aligned, and others where they're not. This is again why it's very important to be to be clear about the welfare function up front. And as to where it fits in the literature, I think that the short answer is I think of it as a tool for trying to understand and correct individual inequalities, either at the level of market access or participation or the way markets themselves work. But I will show you a lot of detail on that soon. All right, let's go to Boston. I just came from there. So we're going to think about a model of centralized school choice. The story is assignment of K through 12 public school seats, and the students, by which we actually mean the parents, are going to be strategic agents. Students have unit demand. Each student wants to go to one school, not 15, and the priorities of the schools are exogenous. So there's some priority ranking over the students. This is going to be the same information, but with notation now. So we'll have a set of students I, a set of schools C, and every student has a preference ranking that ranks schools and the empty school. And then the schools have priority rankings over students, and each one has some maximum capacity Q. A match, this will be our central object, is going to specify an assignment of students to schools, and our rule on matches is going to be that they have to respect capacities. So you can't have more students assigned to a school than the school's total capacity. And then finally, a mechanism is going to assign a match given submitted preferences. Happy so far? Yes?
So I have a sense in a hospital context of like why a hospital has a strong incentive to match really well with the doctor.
Yeah.
From these public schools, how concerned are they? I get why parents would want to go to
Yep.
schools that are good.
Yeah, so the big difference between this and models of doctor-hospital matching is this language around priorities. So here we're assuming the priorities are predominantly, as they are in Boston, fixed by the school system. The schools themselves are not strategic agents trying to game which students they get. In other contexts, that's like in New York, there's some actual strategic behavior on the part of the schools as well, but predominantly the priorities are whatever the school system thinks the rules should be. Exactly. So in practice, this is has to do with the distance from the school and whether you have a sibling in the school, and then there's a random lottery number used to break ties. Great. All right. So what types of things might we want our school choice system to do? So one very basic and I think inarguable goal is to ensure that no student is assigned to a school that he or she finds unacceptable. That sounds good, right? A second one, which is a slightly more refined version of the same idea, is what's called elimination of justified envy. This is a simple fairness condition that says if I wants J's school assignment, then J must have higher priority than I at that school. Strategy proofness we've already talked about. So under the mechanism phi, truthfulness is dominant. So if student I submits his true preferences, then he does weakly better under those preferences than if he submits any other option, p bar I. Another one already alluded to is Pareto efficiency. And then the last one, which we won't talk about a lot today, but is also very relevant in school choice context, is called respect for unambiguous improvements. This means that if I make your priority higher, you'd better get a weakly better outcome. This is higher holding everybody else's relative priorities fixed. So like all I've done is made you better off. In Boston, the tiebreaker is a random lottery number. In Chicago, for the elite public high schools, it's a test score. Respect for unambiguous improvements in that context means you're always incentivized to try and improve your test score. All right, so this is our backdrop of design goals. Does this seem sensible so far? See, aggregate nods, no head shakes, very good. Unfortunately, and as I mentioned before, we're often working up against negative results. There's a strong negative result. So not only is it in general impossible to get Pareto efficient and strategy proof, Pareto efficient and stable matching, but if we ask for Pareto efficient and strategy proofness, Pareto efficiency and strategy proofness, and stability or elimination of justified envy as much as possible, we're still stuck. So we already know we're facing a fundamental trade-off. Many school systems have adopted what's called the deferred acceptance mechanism, which is going to be stable and strategy proof. By the impossibility result I just showed you, you'll then immediately know that it's not Pareto efficient. How does this work? First, every student applies to his or her first choice school. They sort of all walk across and file applications. This is going on in a computer. There's no actual walking across, but it's more entertaining to watch me walk across the room a bunch of times. They file, I hope. They file applications to their first choice school. Each school tentatively holds its highest priority applicants and rejects all others. So now some say really good schools just got more applicants than they have slots. They reject some. Those students who've been rejected walk back across the room, they check their lists, and then they now walk over and apply to their most preferred schools that have not yet rejected them. And again, every school holds its best available set of applicants under the priority order and rejects all the others. We continue this process. Eventually, the students run out of proposals to make, or applications to make, and the result, at the end, I claim, is a stable matching. So, no justified envy. How do we know this? We can check it pretty quickly. Well, let's suppose there's a student who prefers some other school, and that school ranks this student more highly than some student who gives this student higher priority than some student who's actually assigned. So, some student wants to go to Chicago. Chicago has some student with lower priority than that student who wishes he were there. Well, something strange happened, right? Every student applied to their schools in an order of preference. So if this student didn't end up at Chicago, then he must have applied earlier. But then every school held their highest priority applicants. So Chicago must have held a set of applicants with weakly higher priority than this student, or else the student wouldn't have been rejected. Contradiction. Happy? I may have gone through that quickly. I see like 50% nods, no head shakes. Okay, very good. I got off a plane right before coming here, so I'm over caffeinated, which runs the possibility that I will talk too quickly. Okay, strategy proofness is a little bit harder to show, but also true. This is one solution, sort of in that panoply box of things that get us close to some of the design goals we enumerated before. Gets us stability and strategy proofness, does not get us Pareto efficiency, does, it turns out, get us respect for improvements. Here's a very, very similar looking mechanism that lots and lots of school districts have historically used, including up until recently Boston. It's called the immediate acceptance mechanism, although in the literature it's often called the Boston mechanism. Here, every student applies to his or her first choice school. Each school accepts its highest priority applicants up to capacity and rejects all the others. So the only difference, remember before, whoa, that was exciting. Sorry. The only difference relative to before is in this accepts versus tentatively holds. So here we're accepting. Before that, we tentatively held the students. And then we continue. Each not yet accepted student applies to his or her next choice. Each school accepts its highest priority applicants, and we continue. This turns out to be Pareto efficient, but is neither stable nor strategy proof. Yet it has been historically extremely popular. Can anyone guess why?
It's simple.
It's very simple. Yeah. It's extremely easy to explain to parents. Why else? What was it? Sorry, something about the full picture of the whole market?
Yeah, so I'm guessing they're not having the information in the home market, so it's information is
Yeah, so that's actually, yes, that is actually like correct and a more subtle point than I was going for here. Because the parents don't have, so there's a very straightforward strategy to play against this mechanism, which is if your first choice schools, your first through third choice, say, are really popular, you really don't want to list all three of them as your top three choices, right? Because, if you don't get into your first choice, by the time you get to apply to your second choice, it's probably full. And then by the time you get to apply to your third choice, it's probably full, and so forth. So you get a distribution, in complete information, you get a distribution that looks sort of like this. It's like a bunch of people get assigned to their listed first choice, and then a bunch of people out here, at their 10th choice or something. Your point is, in order to play that strategy, you actually have to know something about the relative popularity of the different schools. If you don't, and everyone sort of thinks a good unbiased strategy is to just rank your true preferences, then you get out-of-sample truth-telling. You maybe end up still with this distribution, but it's sort of ex ante random who actually ends up in their 10th choices. There's an even deeper riff on that, which is that if you allow that people know some information, maybe the way in which they choose to strategize reveals some stuff about how strong their preferences are. Totally right. But the simple answer is that the school systems are probably not actually thinking about that. But what they are thinking about is sort of the thing that causes that issue, which is that this mechanism tries to maximize the number of people who get their first choice, right? Give everyone their first choice school to the greatest extent possible. That looks great. And then if people strategize by listing inaccurate first choices, but that they're likely to get into, well, then it gets even better. You get up to the 90th percent. It's 90% of people getting their stated first choice. This is fabulous from a brochure standpoint. But it might not hit everybody equally. So Boston itself said in their guidance booklet on how to use the school choice system that for a better choice of your first choice school, you should consider choosing a less popular school. Right? They understood that this mechanism was manipulable, and they were trying to give parents guidance on how to deal in that environment. Similarly, in St. Petersburg, there was a similar mechanism in use where they found if the selection rejects your first choice, your chances of getting your second choice are greatly diminished. You fall in line behind everyone who wanted your second choice as their first choice, and so forth. And it really starts to look, a little bit sketchy. It gets even sketchier when certain parents groups, we're back in Boston now, get together and figure out which schools are popular and how to game the system, and write to each other on their internal message boards or meeting minutes, we want to find a school you like that is undersubscribed, or find a school that you like, and then pick a safe second choice. So now we have parents sort of getting together and giving each other advice, and we're starting to get away from this, this sort of idealized ex-ante situation where there's sort of, apologies for messing up my philosophy metaphors, where there's almost a veil of ignorance about who is not interested in which schools. So who's sort of in the bins where they're targeting schools that are more popular and who's not. But okay, so that's not scary yet. But what happens if we now, and here's where we're going to put a very simplified behavioral model on the problem. Imagine that some of the parents are very sophisticated and some of them are not. So this is the paper of Pathak and Sonmez. The story is sincere and versus sophisticated parents. We're going to assume that the unsophisticated are truthful. This is both, as it says in the slide, a natural default, and it's been sort of backed up in some lab experiments. And then we're going to assume that the sophisticated parents best respond and ask what happens in equilibrium. So very, very straightforward. You could write this in notation, but they all make sense in words. So under the immediate acceptance mechanism, sincere students are essentially giving up their priorities to sophisticated students. So if they have high priority at some school that they rank as their second choice, and then they're essentially giving up the right to have that priority ranking because the sophisticated students will go and jump for that second choice in the first stage. Sophisticated students never lose their priority. Sincere students might gain priority at the expense of other sincere students. So depending on the distribution of preferences, you might see things move around where some of the sincere students are made better off because sophisticated students clear spaces for them by moving to other schools. The sophisticated students together prefer immediate acceptance to deferred acceptance. They would like to coordinate to set up the immediate acceptance mechanism or keep it in place, as in fact the Westone Parents Group did in Boston. And finally, the sophisticated students would prefer that the sincere remain sincere. So they don't want people to become sophisticated. That in some sense creates more competition. So in response to these ideas, which again, are grounded in economic theory, there's experiments to support them, and there's all sorts of anecdotes. But I presented a theory model. I dropped the notation to state the theorem because the notation doesn't add to the statement. But this is a theory paper. Boston decided to switch from immediate acceptance to deferred acceptance. The story being that a strategy-proof algorithm levels the playing field by diminishing harm done to parents who do not strategize or don't strategize well. Elimination of strategic inequality in sophistication, creating in some sense equal access to the school choice system itself. So this is I like this example, not because it's representative, but rather because it's extremely clean. Right? There are all sorts of other things going on in the Boston public school system, and during the break or something we can talk about all the things that have happened in the ensuing years. But unambiguously, switching from immediate acceptance to deferred acceptance was choosing strategy proofness as the principal goal in practice. And this was a step towards equality of access to the school choice system. Right? The school choice system itself was supposed to reduce inequality in students' access to schools, but there was fundamental inequality in access to the system that was supposed to be providing access. And this was a way to reduce that. Footnote, this is a fantastic paper. I was asked to, on the syllabus thing for this, to recommend a couple papers that I should just tell everyone to read. This one is worth reading. It's very short. It's very easy to read. And it's an absolutely beautiful piece, even just as a theory piece, if sort of Dayenu before you actually have all the practical impact. But it's a great sort of illustration of the way market design thinks about the world, both in terms of the possibilities and in terms of the way you bring together different parts of economics, including in this case a little bit of behavioral economics, to understand how markets could work better. There is lots more school choice theory. So in previous editions of these lectures, I've gone much more deeply into all sorts of other stuff from school choice. Here I'm not going to. We're going to talk about all sorts of other application domains in the second half. But just a quick run through. You might try to incorporate affirmative action or other sorts. Yep.
So can you comment on the trade-off between stability and efficiency in the Boston choice environment? Because we can't get strategy-proof efficiency and stability at the same time. Here they change from the immediate acceptance to deferred acceptance, which is a strategy-proof and stable mechanism.
Yep.
But there are other mechanisms that is strategy-proof and at the same time efficient.
Yes.
And here,
Yeah, that's a great question.
from my understanding, because in the Boston environment, so the priority of students is based on their distance to that school and whether they have a sibling attending that school. And rather than that, it's just a random type ranking, like it's just a lottery. But there are other markets where the priority of students is based on their test score.
Yep.
So what I think is in this environment, maybe efficiency matters more, whereas in the
Yep.
score, exam score. In that case, the stability matters more.
Straight up.
Can you just comment on this?
Yeah. Okay. So let me break down the piece of this question to make sure everyone followed. You're entirely correct. So the observation is we had this backdrop theorem that said we can't guarantee stability, strategy proofness, and Pareto efficiency all at once. Boston made a huge change from, let me go back here, from a mechanism that was neither stable nor strategy proof, although it does happen to be Pareto efficient, to one that is stable and strategy proof and not. This is in some sense a very strange thing to have happen in a school system that is mostly determining priorities based on information that's exogenous and random. Right? It's not saying we're trying to send the students to schools based on their test scores. It's saying we're trying to send students to schools, and here's a lottery number that we use to break ties. We have some course priorities that are driven by siblings and location and so forth. So it happens. So again, in the earlier edition of this talk, so you can either come chat with me during the break or look up the edition from 3 years ago, I went through a third mechanism. There was a slide that looked just like this called the top trading cycles mechanism, which is a mechanism that is strategy proof and Pareto efficient but not stable. And roughly what's going on in this mechanism, you have sort of everyone point to their, everyone's sort of assigned to a school tentatively, they point to their favorite school, and then you find any cycles and rotate the cycle, right? So now we sort of execute a trade among all the students, or among all students to the extent that we can. We execute sort of like large Pareto cycles to improve the allocation from the student's perspective. This is a very, very natural, intuitive idea. It's a super cool mechanism. Happens to be strategy proof, and you can sort of see why, right? We're pointing at things, and if I lie about my preferences, I can only point at the wrong thing at every individual stage. Or I can only change the outcomes by pointing at the wrong thing. Why doesn't Boston do that? So I was not around at the time, but my understanding is that actually that's what the group that redesigned the Boston Public School match proposed initially. So that group, Attila Abdikadaroglu, Parag Pathak, Al Roth, and Typhoon Sonmez, looked at the Boston Public School match and said, yeah, what you have here is a situation where you care about Pareto efficiency, you should be running top trading cycles. And in particular, they said, look, these are the two different strategy-proof mechanisms. They talked about deferred acceptance. They talked about top trading cycles. Deferred acceptance was in the process of being adopted in New York, where they do have these actual two-sided preferences. And they sort of said, look, your system is different in the following reasons. This is why you should adopt top trading cycles. Again, I wasn't there at the time, but my understanding is that top trading cycles was rejected for a different equity concern reason. That the idea of students trading around their priorities seemed to sort of unduly privilege the students, say, who lived in the neighborhoods of the good schools, and maybe create a circumstance in which those students would only be trading among each other. So you might have an outcome in which students who live near bad schools could trade bad schools, and students who live near good schools would trade good schools, but there'd be no actual mixing. And so that sort of like meta welfare concern combined with some stuff about understanding what elimination of justified envy / stability meant in context led them to adopt deferred acceptance instead of top trading cycles. But it's not an obvious decision by any stretch, and there are at least some school systems, New Orleans being the big example of late, that have tried top trading cycles as an alternative. Yep.
There are some structural papers coming up where they're trying to test all of
Yeah.
everything.
Yep.
But I know there's one question on
Yep.
yeah. But then it seems like
These guys.
the ranking of three mechanisms is quite sensitive to the priority rules in the political context.
Yes.
So, how can we ever know? Like, it's always only the ranking commission on what's happening, but we cannot really change those rules.
Yeah, so this is,
Like having more structured papers or more context is the anything we can learn from having a broad range?
this is a great question. So there's a series of structural papers that have been coming out now for the past 4 years or so that have tried to, I got that right? Yeah, 14, so 3 or 4 years, that have tried to understand exactly what the empirical welfare trade-offs between these different mechanisms are. And first of all, there's a becoming robust, I'm not an expert on the structural literature, but my quasi-informed read of it, is there's becoming a consensus that there is actually a real cost to moving to deferred acceptance from from the immediate acceptance mechanism in terms of complete cardinal welfare. That it's like that this is not a costless decision, and that we're sort of and you can think of this in some sense as the social estimate of the value of strategy proofness, right? Like this sort of meta level design desideratum might actually come with an efficiency cost that we can now actually see. But the second fact, which you're right, is that like there seems to be a huge amount of subtlety in these papers between the exact ways in which they model the participant behavior and sort of the exact ways in which the priorities of the school systems interact with the student outcomes. So I don't think we yet have a good way to tell school systems this is how you should take all of these things together as sort of a complete toolkit. We're closer. So 3 years ago, I said I was involved with some of the work with the redesign of the Boston Public School Match, and one of the things that I came away with from that was a view that we really needed to learn how to better speak about these mechanisms in a language of design that is closer to what policymakers want. They often care about welfare outcomes, but none of the language I just showed you can be spoken in the pure language of welfare outcomes. We're closer to that than we used to be, but there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah?
I was just going to ask about work that's been done on parents not knowing exactly what matters in the school. Yeah. From a theoretical perspective, right?
Yep.
And I didn't know what papers there are on that.
That's a great question. So the question is, what do we know about parents? So everything we've done so far assumes that parents actually know how to form their own preferences. This is not necessarily a true assumption, right? Parents might have preferences that are just uninformed. It's costly to acquire information about school quality, or they might have preferences that are sort of biased by some other behavioral consequence, like maybe you have hyperbolic discounting. You care a lot about, it's the most times I've mentioned hyperbolic discounting in one of these lectures. I guess it's becoming more salient. You care a lot about having your child go to school nearby, so you can just drop your child off. But maybe the school that's nearby is not as good, and so you're underweighting the child's long-term future or something like that. There is starting to be work now. So everyone agrees that this is a problem. Like this is an unambiguous, like serious issue. There is starting to be work now in which people are experimenting with different ways of messaging parents about school quality and trying to figure out how informed parents are about the different aspects of schools and how to trade them off. So people are doing field experiments and things with that. And school systems are too, right? So one advantage to running a school choice program that's centralized and organized is you can start to see things like, oh, look, all of the parents in this region are not applying to schools in this other region that is nearby and has better schools. And you as a policymaker can say, gosh, we're unhappy about this. Let's go and do ethnography, try and figure out why and try and fix it. And so school systems are doing this in parallel with researchers. From a pure theory standpoint, I say this is a theoretically loose statement. I can give the more precise version of it afterwards. Mechanisms that are strategy proof generally do better at creating efficient information acquisition incentives than others. That is generally conditional on ex post efficiency, which is why this is a very loose statement. But the hope, I think, is that as we move to mechanisms that give better local incentives for parents, we also do things that will encourage them to make use of information tools. But all of those tools also need to be designed and tested and thought about. More questions? Yeah?
I was wondering about state of literature and the state of research and to what extent these theories travel beyond the borders of Boston. Did that work in Alabama?
I don't know about Alabama specifically, but this transition has happened in a lot of places around the world, both within the US and in the United Kingdom, and so far seems to have been successful. So there's a paper, AER 2013, again by Pathak and Sonmez, where they look at this massive school choice reform series in England, for example, or sorry, throughout the United Kingdom, not just England, where Boston-like or immediate acceptance-like mechanisms were actually made illegal for the reason that they, sort of the general class of mechanisms that tried to maximize the number of students who got their first choice were made illegal because they were felt to create these sorts of strategic malincentives. But for sure, no individual change is a panacea, and so if you're going to go and work in any individual environment, you have to figure out exactly what's going on there. I can't make the sweeping claim that this is sort of the unique school choice solution. It's certainly not.
And what about non-Western countries, or
So China did a series of reforms along the same lines. There's a JPE paper that came out like a couple months ago where a large number of different provinces in China were using mechanisms that were kind of hybrids between deferred and immediate acceptance. And they, all over a period of years, switched to a system or to a series of hybrid systems that were less manipulable, so more strategy-proof and also more stable. I don't know that we have more international evidence than that off the top of my head, but you know, at least there seems to be like a growing robust consensus that at least one thing policymakers often seek to achieve is reducing this manipulation friction. Yep.
Do you have any kind of measure for satisfaction with the process? So you can imagine a process that fails many of these, but somehow people feel satisfied. Maybe that's what was propping up the old way.
Yeah, so how do you measure satisfaction with the process? This one is curious. So there are spike events that make it possible to measure widespread dissatisfaction. I don't know that we yet have a good way to measure sort of like intermediate levels of satisfaction. So there have been crises of confidence in the Boston system in the United Kingdom, which led to this story I just described. There were versions, again, that incited the different Chinese reforms. Like all of these school choice mechanism design reforms tend to follow some instance of widespread dissatisfaction. And if the new mechanism is not well liked, they tend to transition again. I don't know of, this may just be it's possible this is a blind spot, but I don't know of an instance in which people have really done a good job of figuring out how people feel about the process, at the individual level in any of these applications I've described. That would certainly be a useful thing to do. And the time series has now gotten long enough. Some of these things have been around for a decade, so you could actually try and figure that out. Yeah, great question. Let's talk more offline. That's one I'd actually should have a follow-up. I'm not sure what the answer is yet. Yep. All right. Okay, well, we sort of just discussed lots and lots of different directions and pathways of school choice literature. Let me run through these in 25 seconds. Affirmative action. Another thing you might want your school choice system to do is achieve the Friedman-style goal of incentivizing the schools to improve themselves. Unified enrollment, so you might try for a system whereby all the schools, whether they be the public schools or the charter schools or plausibly even the private schools, want to be part of a single system. Cardinal efficiency, so this was this idea I mentioned earlier that if somehow you believed that people had imperfect information and were going to sort of play mixed strategies or do something where they were choosing whether to list a given school as their first or second choice, what you'd really like to do, here's now, this is utility space. So here's utility space. If these two students are the two who are considering manipulating, one of them is basically indifferent between his first and second choice, and the other one is very non-indifferent, strongly prefers the first over the second, you'd like the one who lists the second choice first to be this one. And it turns out that in certain information environments, this is what the immediate acceptance mechanism does. And so this, we think, is part of what's driving those empirical facts I alluded to, that there's a real aggregate welfare cost to going with an ordinal mechanism where you don't gain any new information that's cardinal from people's strategic choices. And then lastly, there's this question of whether these systems actually create true choice at all. Parag sometimes says you can worry that you're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. What we really need to do is make the schools better. Figuring out how to match people to them is a seventh order issue. Sometimes you might not even rearrange the deck chairs particularly effectively. When you're designing these types of systems, you want to watch out for things that are often accidental, like choices of priority structures that can cause endogenous, endogenous segregation among the students, right? That sort of somehow manage to either sort of recreate or even exacerbate the inequalities in access that already exist. And so another principal design goal that started to get some serious theory attention is thinking about how to make priority structures or other features of the system push towards better distributional outcomes. For example, a good heuristic is you don't necessarily only want to give people advanced priority for their neighborhood schools, because if they live in a low quality school neighborhood, that doesn't give them much of a leg up. All right, cool. So that's our school choice story. This should give us, yeah, perfect. We're running right on time for typology. So let's remember our underlying definition space. So what is market design? Application of economic principles and game theory to the design or redesign of market institutions. Hopefully that's a little bit less of an empty statement than it was an hour ago. Yes? No? Maybe? All right, very good. Translating economic theory and analysis into practical solutions to real-world problems, also less of an empty statement, plausibly? Medium? Stop talking, Scott. Very good. So how do you decide when you should actually be doing these types of things? Well, so luckily, there's this natural heuristic, which is you want to go looking for market failures. Unluckily, they don't actually look like these big stop signs that say market failure. It would make our lives much, much easier if you could just sort of like see them, as you're walking down the street. But when I started putting together this version of this series, I sat down to try and think through some specific types of market failure that we see a lot and the types of design interventions that we use to fix them. And so the remainder of the first half, we're going to list through those, sort of sketch just very briefly a couple examples, then we'll come back and go into detail on each one. So first, and this is what we just saw, your goal might be to redesign a marketplace mechanism. There's a market, it exists, it's reasonably organized, but the mechanism that clears the market is suboptimal. Next possibility, oh, and I'm going to list them all, and then we're going to drill down on what they actually mean. So this is not the only chance you have to see this list. Second type of intervention is information provision. And here, today we're going to be thinking particularly about either inequalities in access to information. Think like that example about, do parents know which schools they should be sending their children to? Or ways in which information makes it possible to access or non-access information makes it possible for market participants to endogenously create inequality problems. So think about discrimination in Airbnb. Reshaping the extensive margin. This is this point about thickness I talked about earlier that really matters to get the people in the room. Figuring out how to change and improve people's access to the marketplace itself. And then finally, and this is sort of like, in some sense the big kahuna, sometimes we or policymakers or economists and policymakers together are responsible for creating entire new markets from scratch. So, type 1, marketplace mechanism redesign. So the story here is, in the tagline, a marketplace exists, but it doesn't achieve the welfare or distributional goals that the organizers or policymakers want. This is the type we just saw in the context of the Boston Public School match. It's what I think of as classical market design. So a lot of the earliest market design work done by researchers and policymakers in tandem, or even if you go back to the Middle Ages by sort of, merchant policymakers and things like this. This works often in circumscribed contexts where we can completely define the market and where we can sort of identify most of the participants. Think about school choice. We know who all the children are in principle. And there's somebody who's in position to define the welfare function, right? So there's often, somebody who can say, this is what we're trying to achieve. Can you help us get closer to that? And here, there's still a lot of work to be done because the systems you might use to redesign or to clear school choice programs, assign students to schools, might be totally different from the systems you want to use to resettle refugees. even though these two things in principle are both about some people going somewhere else and trying to make sure that you match them in a way that is fair and efficient. And again, this is sort of very, very different from design of public housing. School choice happens once a year, right? All the students are aging through the grades at the same time, to a first order. They're looking for schools at the same time. Refugee resettlement and housing allocation are both dynamic. People are looking for housing and or a home more generally all the time. One more case, which is the one we'll dig into in the second half, is about the coordination of adoption exchanges. Same thing, uses some of these dynamics, but is yet a different type of problem, both because of a very, very structured regulatory environment and because of, there's sort of already a very well-defined set of players and participants who organize the system, and fairness is absolutely paramount, right? Like these are people who are really specifically trying to maximize the welfare of the children involved, as they should. This is the correct. I think I can avoid going out on a limb by saying this is a correct policy goal. And so much of the exercise there is going to be helping them understand how to use the information that's in their system to do that better. Type 2, information provision. So here the story is participants have unequal information and or, thinking about parents' incentives to collect information about schools, unequal incentives to acquire information. And here, usually, what we're doing as market designers is we're changing the flow of information. We're trying to equalize information or rebalance information within the system in a way that better achieves welfare goals. This means the market organizer might have some information acquisition requirements, him, her, or itself. And a big piece of this is about uninformedness, right? Like, oftentimes the information is there, but participants either don't know that it exists or have no incentive to go look at it. And in both of those senses, this starts to resemble the category I'm going to describe in a second that's about the extensive margin. We'll talk in detail about an entry-level job certification example. Other ones, we already talked about reporting school quality. And then another one that's been done here at the University of Chicago is about mapping health resources. So there's a team called the Southside Health and Vitality Studies group led by Dr. Stacy Lindau here at the Pritzker School of Medicine that has done this extraordinary program called Community RX, in which they've gone and mapped health resources in the south side of Chicago and give individual level health resource access maps and quote unquote prescriptions. Here is where you go and get fruit. Here is your nearest gym, to individual patients who wouldn't have the ability or necessarily the incentive to aggregate all this information on their own. Here, the market organizer went out and got it and can now provide it to them. And this, has not only helps the patients individually, but has huge positive externalities, including improving the quality of care and the amount of focused care that the hospital itself can give. 3, reshaping the extensive margin. So here the story is the market or marketplace exists, but lots of the agents, for whatever reason, do not participate, or relatedly, don't have access. They would participate if they could, but they can't do it. Here, and more generally, I am a huge proponent of the doing of ethnography before you do any form of market design, or arguably any other form of social science research. You should go and talk to some of the people in the market, and I guess if your research program is already ethnographic, you've satisfied the condition vacuously. But if you're doing non-ethnographic social science research, you should do some ethnography very early on. Go and talk to people in the market, understand what it is they think, care about, and believe. This is both sort of just good research practice. Sometimes they will believe things that are not actually true statements about the market, but knowing that alone is very important. Often, they will know things about the market that no part of the research literature has ever recorded, and that can sometimes be answers to things the research literature has named as striking puzzles. Anyhow, in this case, when you're thinking about the extensive margin, you want to find out why people aren't showing up. Figure out the whole pipeline, figure out where the participation breaks down, what is the friction that's keeping people out. We've already talked about transaction costs a bunch. Another big one is historical exclusion that sometimes leads to unawareness or uncertainty about the structure of the market. Another big one actually that I don't think gets large enough or significant enough attention is sometimes people don't participate in a market because the market itself has not like really well-defined participants. A good sort of backdrop version of this is some class action lawsuits, right? Like there are lots and lots of class action lawsuits that all of us, much less our neighbors, have potentially been eligible to be participants in. But like, it's really hard to find all the people who should be involved in the lawsuit. Same thing like, if the market is banking and like, there are lots of individual banks, none of which, there's no sort of centralized system that knows who the set of people who are not using any banks are. No individual bank sort of has the incentive to try and define its catchment area unless that's a specific intentional design goal on their part. The extensive margin, we'll talk a lot in the second half about different digital markets. I mentioned this Airbnb case. We'll talk about a couple others as well. Other big, sort of popular recent example is, the case of public healthcare exchanges. Land reallocation, this is one where locating and defining participants is hard. And in developing world cities, there are lots of areas where property rights are relatively informal and unstructured. And it can be very hard to, and nobody's paying property taxes, perhaps. And it can be very hard to figure out who the correct owners of the land should be, simply because it's hard to define the set of potential owners of the land, much less like how you would trade them off against each other and how you would compensate those that are forced to move away if you then title the land to someone. But as a result, if nobody holds title, nobody can invest on the property, nobody can try and improve it, and so there's a lot of welfare lost simply from the informal property holdings. Another big one here that we had a conference here this past last summer, around this time actually, and a senior administrator from Franklin and Marshall came and talked about work that Franklin and Marshall had done to identify students who were observationally equivalent to the students they were admitting, but were from lower income or otherwise sort of lower ex-ante school access backgrounds, but like were identical. So like there was no sort of functional difference between these students other than background, and on all sort of metrics used to define admission, they were the same. They went out and found a bunch of these students and said, look, you guys could apply to Franklin and Marshall. Some of you should also be applying to even higher level schools. Gave them information about the possible colleges they were potentially eligible for and sort of simplified their application processes. They've just graduated their first class of these students, and they graduated at exactly the same rate as the people who were ex-ante identical, which was a huge win for Franklin and Marshall because they got higher threshold quality students essentially for free, right? They were able to improve the socioeconomic diversity of their student body while simultaneously doing nothing to change the quality of their their entry margin, right? They were admitting students who were identical, just some of them didn't think they could apply. And those sorts of, there's all sorts of other stuff on college access channels. I'll have a slide, brief slide on the Posse Foundation later on. There are all sorts of alternate college access channels in play at the moment, but there are huge gains from trade to be had because some people simply aren't applying at the level that they're eligible for. Last, market creation. So here the story is, the market is missing. So there's some reason that the market or marketplace or sort of implementing marketplace doesn't exist. These, in some sense, these are some of my favorites, even though I'm mostly a theorist. I like these because the theory is often stupid, right? It's like, here's a good that's being thrown out. Think about food banks. How do food banks get supplied? Grocery stores or other institutions that go through a lot of food donate food that they would otherwise not be using. It's being thrown out. That was the outside option. It's either going to be donated or tossed. Other people want it, and so all we need to do is like somehow run a market. Lots of classical economics would tell us we're done. Here, I guess we come back to your question again about frictions. Yet the practical theory is really subtle, right? You have to go and look and say, gosh, why isn't there a market here? And that's often the first step on the way to a really interesting question. We'll see the context of food supply at the end of the second half. Other examples, lots of data exchanges, lots of opportunities for people to provide their information into centralized systems that could be used to set policy in ways that are more productive. But it's very, very hard for people to share data safely and privately. Other examples, things like youth summer employment programs, systems that help the allocation of teachers, both inside of institutions like Teach for America, maybe now, 7 years ago or so, adopted a system. Well, they've actually done 2 different versions of this. There was a system they adopted about 7 years ago and another one maybe 3 years ago, where people tried to design the system to improve the teachers, to improve the extent to which the teachers were being allocated to places they wanted to end up, and this reduced teacher attrition. Essentially their previous system was pretty disorganized and there was a lot of attrition, and so they would have to, and these were teachers leaving after they'd already sort of closed their class, so they were just losing teachers relative to their estimated target. With an improvement in the allocation, they could ensure more teacher assignment, more teachers, or better, sort of more teacher-preferred assignments, and more teachers stayed. And so they are, again, switching from sort of a essentially non-market system to an organized and slightly market-driven system, again, with all sorts of fairness constraints and things set up as part of it, improved participation and retention. Okay, so that's our 4. Marketplace mechanism redesign, information provision, reshaping the extensive margin, and market creation from essentially whole cloth. We will drill down into all of these in more detail in part 2. But just a couple of footnotes. First of all, hopefully I have convinced you at least that this is, that this is fun. I do market design because I tremendously enjoy it. I think it's a very powerful way to think about and use economics. And, and it has all of these, sort of excellent theory pieces to it, but then we project our theorems down onto reality, take theory literally into practice. Golden ratio, all the better. And secondarily, it's not a thing that just economists practice, and it's certainly not a thing that was invented 20 years ago, right? Like a lot of the doing of economic policymaking, whether it's by policymakers and governments or entrepreneurs who are building marketplace businesses, is still market design. It's, you're using an understanding of markets and incentives to inform our design of policy solutions. This 4-part typology I gave you is not actually a typology per se, because a typology, according to the dictionary, is mutually exclusive. These are not mutually exclusive, nor is it exhaustive. I don't believe the word typology implies exhaustiveness, but I'm not certain. Different types of market design overlap. You already started to see that. And in fact, in the second half, I'm going to cover the middle 2 cases together because they're so tightly linked. And then finally, sort of those lists of examples at the bottom, I specifically attuned to be contexts that relate to inequality. But all the stories I've told you so far about the different types of markets we may redesign work in all sorts of other contexts as well. So while I hope everyone will come away from this week thinking that they are now empowered and teched up to try and fix inequality at scale, if you leave this feeling powered and teched up to, and desirous of building spectrum auctions, everything I've said so far will enable you to do that as well, I hope. So that wraps up our typology and discussion. Ready for part 2? So what comes after talk? It had better be action. No? All right, well. So we just finished working our way through thinking about what it is to do market design in the abstract. I ran you through one detailed example from Boston School Choice, and then I laid out this typology. The total talk-to-action ratio was gigantic. Hopefully in the second half, we'll invert this so that the product of the 2 halves is equal to unity. So first, just a massive and yet barely scratching the surface list of application domains where people have thought about market and marketplace redesign in inequality-related contexts. So a couple we've already hinted at, and I've promised we'll talk about soon. So adoption and food bank food allocation. Another big one is housing. And here, both there's work on marketplace mechanism redesign to redesign the systems that are used to allocate public housing. But there's also sort of very, very important work, and here I cite Matthew Desmond, for thinking about how our entire housing system contributes to inequality and how we might improve it. Desmond makes this very strong case that eviction is not just a consequence of poverty, but a causal input to poverty itself, that the inability to maintain a home traps people and makes them unable to advance, and argues for, for recognizing housing as a fundamental right and thinking about how the government can provide it much more robustly than even sort of existing public housing type solutions. All of these contexts are places where there's real work for us to think about design. Another one that's very, for better or for worse, in the media a lot of late is immigration. I'll allude briefly to the specific case of refugee resettlement a little bit later. But more generally, there are lots and lots of ways in which reducing borders and other barriers can enable people to sort, again, like in sort of the economist sense, to sort efficiently, but in a way that also enriches them, right? And many papers reach this conclusion. One in particular that was first presented at an HCEO conference is Glenn's paper on the returns to lowering barriers for migration for labor. Healthcare, I already talked about the Community RX program that Stacy Lindau and company worked on. At the conference here last year, and I've been reminded to point out, almost all of the lectures and other presentations from the conference last year are online on the HCEO website. So in case you do not get enough inequality studies during the day, you can go home in the evening and learn about individual application domains from this and other verticals. And I'm happy to chat about all of this stuff over the course of the week or in the future. At that paper, Kate Ho presented this, at that conference rather, Kate Ho presented this extraordinary paper that looked at required carriers, required provision in healthcare plans. So, what's the effect if you require, say, the Dana-Farber Cancer Center be in all of the Boston healthcare plans? In principle, the reason you would want to do this is to ensure that everyone has access to tier 1 cancer care. But it has a funny second-order effect, which is that it makes Dana-Farber now a monopolist. It makes it the case that Dana-Farber can raise the rates charged to all the insurers, sometimes pricing out of access exactly the people you were trying to create access for. And so she and Robin Lee have thought a lot about how to try and address these types of problems and how to spot them before you create them accidentally through healthcare policy. We'll talk a bunch about the digital economy. Here, a lot of the issues we'll focus on have to do with privacy, but there are also, and both situations in which you want more privacy and situations in which you want less. But there are all sorts of questions about access to digital technologies and the things that they do both to a first order and then second order, like creating labor markets in the sharing economy and such. We mentioned earlier teacher allocation. Both of these sites have to do with Teach for America, but there's much, much more to think about here as well. Youth employment. We'll talk about online labor markets, but there's also, of course, lots of things to think about in offline labor markets and trying to reduce frictions that harm people's abilities to reach jobs and or harm employers' abilities to find qualified candidates. And then this is sort of, in an earlier draft of the slide, I just had an ellipsis right here. Almost all of the stories we'll talk about today are predominantly in developed countries. All of these problems get more complicated in the developing world. And market design as a field is only starting to think about this now, led in part by one of my new colleagues at HBS, Ben Roth. Once institutions like contract enforcement start to disappear, all the problems get harder, and you care a lot more about sort of easy to monitor solutions that can be tracked and enforced without creating opportunities for new corruption. And so there's lots of interesting design problems there. And again, in places where the first order theory looks the same to what they might be in the developed world, as soon as you remove enforcement, the problems get much harder, but equally, if not more important. Cool. So that's our like hierarchy. Well, it's not a hierarchy. It's not ranked. Our sequence of application domains in a massive nutshell. We're going to talk about these 4 that I've already highlighted in detail this afternoon, but I'm happy to talk with you and or help you find access to people and or references on any of these others to the extent that you're interested. Cool? Awesome. So, everybody take a deep breath. We're about to actually start doing some stuff on the ground in different markets. Keep calm and design markets. Right. So, case 1. We already saw an example of this. We're going to do a second example reasonably quickly. Marketplace mechanism redesign. The story, as you'll recall, a marketplace exists, but it doesn't achieve the intended welfare or distributional goals. We just saw this in Boston, where the principal issue was strategic inequality. Now we're going to talk about coordination of adoption exchanges in Pennsylvania. So this is based on joint work by Slaw, Aken, Keston, and Unver. Keston very involved in work in school choice, and Utku, Unver has been involved in school choice and kidney exchange. This was a project that I believe Vince Slaw brought to them originally, where the Pennsylvania Adoption Exchange is a sort of, medium-scale system set up to support nonprofits and to find adoptive families. And in particular, it's the part of the adoption infrastructure in Pennsylvania that deals with placing children who are, for one reason or another, difficult to place. They have detailed data on children and family preferences, and what they're a matchmaker. They're recommending matches for children to families. This is a real dollar terms, a huge market, leaving aside the welfare of children component. Just like this is a huge market from a welfare perspective, and we're talking about order of 15,000 children in foster care and about 2,000 waiting for adoption. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that it really matters to be placed to a permanent family, and in particular, it matters for your short-run educational outcomes and your long-term life outcomes, and also it matters. The earlier you can be placed, the better. This existing exchange was something, sort of like an intermediary among caseworkers, and the caseworkers were not happy with the way it was working. So that's our red stop sign, potential market, or maybe our yield sign, potential market failure here. But they thought there were possible opportunities to use the registration data in a way that was more productive. And so here's where the avenue for economic design opened up, right? A market that's not producing optimal outcomes for its participants is not enough to go in and fix it. Sometimes there are, existing endogenous forces that keep the market in place, or the failed market structure in place. Here, the participants of the market did think there was an opportunity for improvement, and this group of market designers got together to try and help them figure out what those opportunities were. So what did they do? They reviewed registration and outcome information to understand adoption trends. They ran, collected and organized the existing data, ran some big regressions to try and figure out what was, reducing the probability of adoption. I should make sure I have this in the right coordinates. I think this is what increases probability. Let's see. Where's something that's, so lots of different special needs, reduce your probability of being adopted. Certain education levels, increase it. Foul language, these are the children who are hard to place. But even within them, among them, there are individual characteristics that make them more or less likely to be placed. And the first thing that happened was just by organizing and looking at the data, the market design team found some factors that drove non-adoption that the Pennsylvania Adoption Exchange had not previously realized. So they knew, existing disciplinary problems were things that were likely to reduce children's propensity to be adopted, but other things were there that were not originally recognized. And they took all of this together and tried to build a tool that used the input data to propose matches. They would both try to understand, the relationships between characteristics and adoption likelihood, and how to respond to, potential adoptive parents' offers of adoption. And in particular, the parents would give preferences, or the prospective parents would give preferences. So they were collecting from parents, is it okay if the child has these, features, or which of these features do you desire more than others? And previously, the system was relatively, first in, first out. It was trying to clear in a relatively more flow system. What Slaw and collaborators found was that if they used narrow matching, so if they tried really hard to match characteristics to preferences directly, which sounds harder, right? This is an integer programming problem. We're now asking to line up on all of these different dimensions rather than just asking to agree on some of them, that they could do a lot better. So you could get large gains in the probability that a child would actually be adopted after being suggested to a parent or a set of parents. And on top of that, they were able to identify some types of data that would be useful to have. And so the adoption exchange is now going out to collect more information that they can use to train yet a better model. And then on the other side, they noticed this thing, which is sort of part of their current work. The parents have a funny strategic incentive because the preferences are collected once. And then the parents are sort of offered, how about this child? How about this child? And so, but can always say no. So, and for any reason, and you wouldn't want to design a system that didn't have this property, right? Suppose the family just had a massive wealth shock, or a transitory wealth shock, or a health shock, or something like this. That's a better example. A transitory health shock. You'd want to give them the opportunity to say, I can't adopt a child right now, without leaving the system and never coming back. But because once they have that option, now you're incentivized to sort of list as permissive a set of preferences as possible to maximize your number of choice opportunities. We'll see echoes of that type of setup in the future, or in later case studies. And so now, so what they found was that lots of parents were representing preferences that didn't actually show up empirically when they then were offered potential children for adoption. And so now they're working on trying to deal with once you use narrow matching, you can try and make the system more directly attuned to the submitted preferences in a way that can also incentivize more accurate preference representation by parents. So stage 0, they built a data tool, or so they did some data analysis. Stage 1, they built a data tool to improve matches with the data they had. Stage 2, they're collecting new data informed by the initial analysis to try and do yet better. Stage 2 prime, they're trying to make the system incentivize parents to state more accurate preferences that then make their tools even more effective. Yeah?
Can you tell us more about how much time is lost when people strategically manipulate here? So for instance, in a different kind of case like a kidney exchange, I see huge time sensitivity.
Yeah.
Here I'm thinking, obviously you want to get this child adopted quickly, but if it takes an extra week,
no, that's a great question.
How long do families have to turn up for adoption?
Yeah. So I don't know the exact answer to your question, but I can definitely explain how this is different from the kidney exchange context and what the what the manipulation concern, why the manipulation concern here is first order as well. So in the context of kidney exchange, kidney exchange, we haven't actually talked about this application in any detail. Quick explanation. If someone wants to, if you have end-stage renal failure and need a kidney transplant, God forbid, I hope this doesn't happen to anyone in here or to anyone any of us are close to, but in the circumstance in which you're in this category, you might have a willing kidney donor, say a spouse or other family member, who is not able to donate to you because of blood or tissue type incompatibility. And so what we now do is a series of what are called kidney exchanges, where you take patient-donor pairs who are incompatible and match them with other patient-donor pairs who are also incompatible but are crosswise compatible. So their donor donates to your patient and you donate to their patient, or something of the sort, or more complex ones in chains. Kidneys, like potential adoption candidates, have the property that you need to be able to turn one down at any time. Maybe the patient is currently unwell and so could not accept a transplant at this moment, but that then introduces incentives to misrepresent your preferences over possible kidneys, both at the exchange level and if you receive a deceased donor kidney. If you're at the top of the waiting list and you're offered a deceased donor kidney from a 80-year-old who died of pneumonia, your doctor might say, no, let's wait and see if some some younger person dies in a car crash and donates the organ to you, that'll be healthier and it'll buy you extra years. And there's a real cost of calling people and having them say no, because kidneys don't last that long on ice, right? And it's the case that kidneys can expire while waiting to try and find a recipient who's willing to take them from the deceased donor pool. Here, while certainly you want to get children matched to families as quickly as possible, it doesn't have this day of must match the child concern for sure. But with this narrow matching, sort of with this high dimensional characteristic type, if you think you've assigned a maximal matching in some sense, and then pieces of it fall through, you create the possibility that you should have been doing something completely different, right? That you could have sort of matched more people in this month's round, potentially many more if you satisfied the preferences differently. That's where the gain from knowing accurate preferences comes from. But I agree, it's not nearly as directly biting as in the kidney exchange case. Further questions? Yeah?
So in the batching example, you write overrepresenting willingness, but are there actually figures that demonstrate this as well?
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry. So in the example of batching, so now we're still talking hypothetically about the willingness. Are there actual figures that demonstrate this?
So they have internal evidence on this. They haven't actually tested what would happen, or rather, they are now testing what happens with a swap, so we don't have empirics on the improvement yet. They have some simulations in the paper based on the internal evidence of how much this will change things. I think check with that team in about somewhere between 6 months to a year, and hopefully, and we'll either have we'll either have a positive reinforcement of the things from the simulation predictions, or we'll have a new wrinkle to sort out and understand. All right. So for each of these case study examples, I'm going to, at the end, sort of try and do a riff that shares some features, but is slightly different, just to prove that these are not one of the problems with case studies I teach at Harvard Business School, there's always this concern that the case study is, extremely specific, but in fact, all of them are supposed to exhibit general principles. So I'm going to try and show you a second example each time to convince you that there's something general going on. Here, I know we were talking during the break, there's all sorts of types of people who need homes. One that I've had Epsilon involvement in is this work on refugee resettlement matching, which has been going on now, or people have been working on different pieces and angles of, both in Europe and in the United States. Here, Alex Tailboim, who's one of my closest collaborators, jointly with Will Jones, has been thinking about what they call the local refugee match. So once refugees are assigned to countries, incidentally, that's what Rappaport thought about better market designs for. But once you've been assigned to a country for resettlement, the country then has to assign you to a local area for resettlement. And here, there's a lot of evidence that if that local area choice is good in the sense that that you're placed into a place where there's an existing community you can integrate into, where there are local labor market needs and schools for your children, your long-run outcomes are much, much better than if not. The funny thing is, there's undersupply of refugee resettlement places. Even so, they're not all being used up, right? So there's a circumstance where we have goods that are over-demanded, but we're not even distributing the ones we have. And on top of that, there's not very much effort being made to try and match the resettlement locations with individual refugees' skills, human capital, or to a lesser degree, things like health needs. And so, Alex and Will and company, including David Delacritas, an extraordinarily brilliant graduate student, and a panoply of people. They're really, there's a next slide. There's a long ... have been trying to figure out systems for taking into account both refugees and localities' preferences and providing matches for refugees to local areas that are better for all involved. Sort of do a better job of respecting the localities' preferences and that encourage, or that enable refugees to match to places where there are labor markets they can fit into, linguistic overlap, all of these things. To do that, you have to solve a second problem. Oh, sorry. Before we go there, one intended purpose of this, that we'll have to see whether, if this technology makes it into practice, how well it works. But the hope is that if you match refugees to areas in ways that are more productive for the refugees and for the areas, right? If you fill local labor market needs, move your software engineers from Syria to cities that need more coders. Then the local areas themselves might open up additional capacity for taking refugees. And so there's, and this will be a bit of a theme as well. Often if you improve the market clearing as it clears today, you might bring in more supply in the extensive margin in a way that's also welfare improving. In order to do any of this correctly, there's a second problem you have to solve, which is that the refugees moving, say, to the United Kingdom often don't actually know much about where they're going. Right? If you're going to elicit preferences from refugees over places to which they might like to move, you need some way of informing them about where they might want to be. Towards this, Alex and Will and a number of others have partnered together to form a small nonprofit called Refugees Say, which is both about sort of developing this matching technology, but more it's about developing information technology. So smartphone applications that allow people who have already moved to send back information about what the different places are like. It's also supposed to provide bridge employment, so like people can translate information about local areas into their native languages and exchange, while they're looking for jobs. And then we'll provide people information as they move about where they might want to be placed that they can then use to form their preferences. I give Alex and Will the greatest credit. I mean, so we talk some, and it's a debate within economics and within academia more generally about how much we should be actually doing the parts of translation that are not directly a part of our field's science. This is sort of way above and beyond, but I think is a wonderful model, right? Like if you're going to try and fix the system that matches refugees to their local areas, you also have to fix the system that informs refugees about the potential places to which they might move. And you also have to be hoping eventually to fix the system of information that feeds local areas information about mostly the negative aspects of refugees at the moment and try and help them understand the data a little bit more correctly. And they've taken on all of this. Very honored to have played an epsilon part in it. This is a huge project with a huge team of collaborators, and like some of you, depending on the types of problems you choose to attack, might find yourselves going in the same way. And there's a big synergy, again, between the sort of the doing of the theory. So this is a theory paper, this is a policy paper, and this is an entrepreneurship exercise, and they all feed into each other. All right. Any questions, or can we move on to information provision? Cool. How are we doing on time? Perfect. All right, so as I promised, we're going to cover information provision and the extensive margin together. So quick reminder, information provision, participants in the market have unequal information and/or unequal incentives for information acquisition. And the extensive margin, so there's a market that exists, but agents do not participate, some at least do not participate, and some might wholly lack access. These two are often very closely related. We had some conversations about this over the break as well, too. Often, the reason people don't participate is because they lack information about the market, or the reason they lack access is because participants in the market don't know about them, or vice versa. First example is going to be entry-level labor market certification. And here this is a paper, sorry, it's a funny typo on the slide here. That should say benefits. I have no idea how that came to be, but just imagine that's blank. This is a fantastic paper by Mandy Palace. So what's the story? So framed in the language of all of classical labor market theory, young workers are more likely to be unemployed than older, more experienced workers. And a key question is whether those poor outcomes result from human capital deficiencies or barriers to labor market entry. If it's the former, then they might need to engage in intensive education or training to succeed. But if it's the latter, then programs that simply give these workers a foot in the door might have long-lasting benefits. So here's the experiment. So we're on an online labor market, think Odesk or Elance. How do these systems work? Anyone who wants can register an account to provide labor. You tell the system something about your skills, but there's no direct certification. You say, I am really good at running static regressions and writing theory models. And your profile says, here is so-and-so. So-and-so is a graduate student in economics and is really good at writing, running regressions in Stata and writing theory models. Has done 0 jobs to date, has 0 job market papers to date. But you can hire this person to run your regressions. And then employers come and they post jobs and they sift through. The system helps them a little bit, but to a first order, they're sifting through and trying to find potential employees to hire. So here's the experiment now. Workers were randomized into 3 groups, 2 treatments and a control. The treatments were both about evaluation. So there'd be a course evaluation and a detailed evaluation. And in both evaluation groups, after, all of these workers were hired. But in the evaluation groups, there was a 1 to 5 rating, like a star rating, calculated directly from performance statistics. And then then there was an additional sort of public comment. One, in the detailed case was detailed, and in the course evaluation was not very detailed. So what's going to happen? So Mandy's going to hire a bunch of employees to do a uniform task, and then give them mechanical feedback that just assess the quality of performance, with some information about, at different levels of detail about how the task was performed. And so here is the impact of the treatment on both whether the worker has any job ex post and the total jobs. And the initial effect is extremely stark. So if you get this sort of initial review, then your chance of being hired quickly, again, by a non-economist experiment, Odesk job, is much, much higher. This is cool, right? Going back to that theory frame, this looks like the ladder. So, barrier to labor market entry, this big pool of seemingly identical workers, okay, there aren't, it's not a lot of economics PhD students. It's a lot of people who are good at data entry or like medium level coding. I've used Odesk to write to hire people to write BibTeX files before. Like you can find people who've who speak fluent tech, but it's really, really hard to sift through any of them. A nice simple heuristic is, okay, I'm only going to hire someone who has a positive rating. Well, somebody having a real rating is instantaneously advantaged under that heuristic, even though they might be identical on type to everybody else. And this is just an information failure, and it's one that's really easy to correct, right? Like, if this generated enough flow revenue for Odesk, Odesk could do this. They could hire everyone to do a temporary task. You then worry about gaming the temporary task and whether there'll be a whole secondary market of people doing the temporary task or something like this. But, suppose you can screen all of that stuff out. Like, they could hire everyone, or do other forms of direct certification. Like, yes, this person really is a PhD student, to create much more access at the entry stage to this online labor market. Big real welfare gains. I apologize, I don't remember the exact details of these back of the envelope calculations, but like highly non-trivial welfare gains. And Mandy's conclusion is that the act of hiring a worker caused the market to positively update its belief about the worker, exactly as you'd expect. And this is cool. You can use it in all sorts of other contexts. Here's our transition to a similar but different case. There's been a massive increase in the use of non-standard skill certification through contests, through data analysis contests. Think about, here we have one from Driven Data that some collaborators of mine and I were involved in, but there's Kaggle, there's all these different companies that allow companies to sort of farm out data for competitive solving or competitive analysis. Whoever clears the benchmark and produces the most effective solution, the most effective analysis. I'm still in my market design brain mode. Here you're actually analyzing, you're not solving necessarily. The most effective analysis usually wins a prize, but the prize is small. The real prize is that you get to write on your resume, I won this data contest. Even if you don't have a degree, in data science or, or statistics or whatever, maybe this is a way that you can clearly certify that you really have taken those 5 Coursera courses, right? There's much more access to educational information. Now you can actually demonstrate ability as a way of certifying rather than acquiring a costly degree. Not yet completely mainstream or standard. There's research to be done to figure out exactly how companies think about these alternate certifications. As a side note, like we know that we know lots of heuristic and anecdotal stories about them helping. And this contest that I was involved in, all of the top people had non-standard training, like and we're often from all over the world, or mostly from all over the world. We don't yet know exactly what this does in the labor market, how it compares to having the degree in practice. But I think it's unambiguous that it's starting to be considered a real certification, and that as this technology gets more robust and the opportunities get better, both there will be more of it, it'll be more respected, and it should move down the chain from things that are from data science to things that are more accessible. So that's information and extensive margin intervention 1. Just to keep balance, we're going to do a second one, but let's take questions before we transition. Yeah?
Does authors have some estimate of how valuable this is to companies like Yelp or whoever is offering the contest? Because it seems like they have a ton to gain, regardless. You're wondering why there's not more of this.
Yeah, the question is, do we have any good estimate of how much companies can gain by running these data analysis contests? First answer, yes, it must be huge. I don't know that we have good. It has the funny feature that there's a little bit of downside risk in that, maybe your crowdsourcing fails. So you can't use it for things that are totally mission critical, but you can use it for exploratory, future things, future projects. I don't know whether there's a robust estimate of exactly what the gains are. The place I would look first is maybe Karim Lakhani's work, but I'm not certain. Good question. And yeah, I guess if we had a better, I guess one of the challenges is you'd have to find an estimate that's robust across companies or types of companies. And I don't even know how you would start trying to figure that out. But if you had such a thing, that would certainly be an important step towards really understanding the value of the credential as well. More questions? Yeah.
I think in this case, would you be worried that since there's not only from one institution, that someone could pay someone to do this?
Yeah. So the question is, could someone just pay someone else to do it for them? Great question. And this is what I was talking about when I said, if Odesk were to adopt a system whereby they gave everyone a starter task, you would certainly expect to see a market in people doing the starter task for you. In the data contests, it's hard, right? So the prizes in the contests are reasonably low. So if there were a market in people paying to have somebody else solve the contest for them, it would have to be because the chance of being hired after winning one of these was so high that you could essentially afford to pay some non-trivial fraction of the value of the job. We're not there yet. I mean, a similar sort of story has occurred historically with people trying to hire other people to take the SAT for them, for example. And there, the solution is to require people to bring photo ID to the SAT and check them pretty carefully. I think if we reached a point where this was a really lucrative strategy, a sufficiently lucrative strategy that people would rather solve the contests for others than solving them for themselves, right? The thing this has going for it, of course, is that if you're the data scientist who can win this contest, you have a lot to gain by winning it yourself rather than for your neighbor. But if it ever became lucrative enough that somebody could basically run a business winning the contest for all of his or her neighbors, then you'd have to see better development of security and identity screening technology. But I think we're far from there so far. Yeah?
This can also bring up new inefficiencies. Like the tournament model of labor
Yeah.
is not a very efficient one because
Totally right.
basically everyone who's not in the top 30 in terms of talent or something should not be
Correct.
in the market at all.
Yeah, so the question here is tournament model of labor. This is not necessarily the way you actually want to run a labor market because there's huge amounts of wasted effort. It's actually an all-pay auction right? That everyone is putting in effort, and then the top, or in this case, the top 3 people win prizes, but there might be 50, 100, 700 submissions, for sure. I have a friend, Ron Siegel, who thinks a lot about the optimal way to design these types of contests, using some stuff out of auction theory. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone directly apply some of their calibrated sort of welfare optimal mechanisms, but there's certainly there's certainly pure theory to practice stuff that could be done there. But the better and more correct answer is that as we move into realms where non-standard skill certification is valuable, we need to figure out ways of doing more than just certifying a winner or something like this, right? For example, a very simple a simple solution in the context of these data analysis contests is you could essentially give someone a badge, like a certified sticker or certificate or something that identifies how they performed and what they demonstrated the ability to do, so that even if they didn't find the solution that the company eventually adopted, they still gained some of the value from the participation. And I'm sure there's more that could be done. That's just the first answer off the top of my head. Great point. This, incidentally, is a hugely cracked open area for sort of interesting applied market design stuff. Like, really, people have only started running these contests in the last 7-8 years. And nobody that I know has thought really carefully with any of these companies about how to actually design the incentive schemes optimally. Great question. Yeah?
It just seems like a lot of these, this is brought up, the contests are a lot like personnel contracts and contracting theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering how much you would consider that part of market design, right? Because it's not technically a whole market, I guess, but the contract itself is.
Yeah, so the question is, gosh, this sounds a lot like personnel economics and then personnel contracting. Is this or is this not market design? You're not working at the entire market level. You're certainly not an eye in the sky completely designing the marketplace. Odesk you might be, but this you're not. There's this gigantic outside labor market of people with data analysis skill. So the answer I'm about to give is opinion and slightly controversial, so flagged as such. First of all, I think market design, really what we meant to be talking about, or are meant to be talking about, is the thing that's broader, that I like to call economic design, for lack of a better term, right? That really this translational aspect of economics is all of the instances in which we're using economics to inform our design of interventions in the real world. And the big difference is more about sort of whether we're doing this at the micro or macro scale. Like if we're doing it, things like micro-informed optimal tax policy are maybe at the boundary. Design of labor market contracts are certainly in the micro category and certainly have all the structures of the same type of market design I've described. And sort of global tax policy is maybe more a thing that looks like regulation and is not sort of directly informed by individual micro level effects. I think of sort of economic design as certainly at least or economic or microeconomic design as encompassing all of those micro-level interventions, irrespective of whether you're working at the scale of an entire market. So another thing that would be in that category is an app that runs on your smartphone and tries to help you correct your own known behavioral biases or something like this, should you so want to. Revealed preference is important. You don't turn it on people's phones unless they choose to install it, like a Stick K app or something. But that's controversial, right? Some people would say that market design is really only things that are at the level of the individual market, and or would say that the definition I just gave is so broad as to encompass all of economics, and so it sort of doesn't actually define anything. But I think that latter critique is wrong, because what I'm caring about is the translational aspect. I'm trying to fix things in the real world using the ideas and processes of economics, and I think that's sort of a way of thinking about economics in the same way that economics is a way of thinking about the world. Yeah?
I have a question related to your last point.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that all this market design means an approach to some components don't really address the root cause of inequalities, rather some of the consequences. I mean, even if we take the examples of, let's say, teachers, I think the bigger question here is why do we have such staggering levels of inequality when it comes to schools in the first place, as opposed to just going on with the mechanism to match teachers more efficiently. Or with example, with regards to adoption, why do we have so many abandoned kids in the first place that we need a more efficient system to match them? Or with youth unemployment, why is the economy so bad in the first place that so many people, so assuming young people are more to deal with.
So, point taken, tremendous, for sure that lots of these solutions are, solving things that are on the surface and haven't yet dug to the root cause.
Fixes,
But
the bigger mechanism is like breaking apart all the time, and we're just trying to stitch here and there.
no, so I don't know that I buy the view that market or economic design is just stitching here and there all the time. Certainly, lots of the individual applications to date have been things that have been in relatively circumscribed contexts. I think the field is moving away from that. But also, they started there because those were things they understood how to solve, and often they snowball, right? A lot of the work on school choice mechanism redesign has led subsequently to work on trying to understand how to learn from the parents in the school system what's failing them in the school system, and then using these same sorts of insights to think about how to design better incentives for schools and better school structures. Similarly here, this is a classical question in labor economics, and the solution is a fairly straightforward market design intervention, right? If the question is, why can't people enter the labor market? There are lots of possibilities. One of them is availability of human capital. Another one is the one that Palace finds here. And just because the intervention is relatively straightforward, that's a feature here, not a bug, right? If it were actually the case that a small amount of early employment plus certification was enough to gain people the access to to participate in the labor market, that's a thing that could be rolled out much more broadly.
Yeah, it's not like an accusation. It seems to me that it might be distracting from the bigger picture.
I think it's, I don't know. The goal is not to be distracted from the bigger picture. Bigger picture problems are harder to solve, and so they have to be solved in phases. I think, as an economic designer, one should spend a lot of time trying to solve every layer of the problem, and certainly the goal is eventually to get to the root cause. I don't know whether, I think you can argue or have views about whether one individual solution does or does not. But I don't think it's a sense in which that's not the goal. Yeah?
I think a lot of this comes from the roots of economics, right? The idea of creating systems in which people's incentives naturally align for a better outcome globally.
Yep.
Right? I think that's how, in a lot of ways, for example, if you want to talk about improving teacher quality, there's tons and tons of people and lots of money goes into trying to understand how to improve teacher quality. Mm-hmm. And there are multiple facets to that. Some of them are definitely outside the scope of economics. And so I think that the point is that economics is particularly well suited for understanding how to align incentives, which is often a part of the solution.
Much better said than I could have said it myself. Thanks. Yep.
I think this maybe ties into the conversation, but I know you had said in the beginning that sometimes you'll have these contradictions between what will make a market more efficient versus what will make it more equal.
Yep.
And I was thinking about that. I think you could probably come up with an example for most of these, but I was thinking particularly with adoption. I know that there's research on racial disparities and who gets adopted, and if you could imagine a situation in which having increased information results in maybe more adoption matches are happening, but
they're less equal.
A certain subset of children. So I was just wondering how that if you could talk more about these kinds of situations.
For sure. Do you have a riff off that? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I keep on thinking about discouraged workers in this particular conversation, and again, to the same point that you've been responding to, I recognize that that's a big problem, and it's only going to be a growing problem, and it might not be a solvable problem at this point, but it just keeps popping back into my head about sort of young, discouraged workers. Where it's both an access problem, an information problem, a market creation problem, and a social problem. There's so many pieces intersecting with that, but just love your thoughts.
Yes. And Larry, was your thing part of that same stream? Okay, great. We'll add yours. Then I'll attempt to give plausible answers to the whole set. Go ahead.
Right. So I want to introduce myself quickly. I'm Larry Bloom. You'll be hearing from me tomorrow on social networks. So Scott, I think that to some degree this discussion, or your presentation, it really has undersold, I think, what market design is all about. I think that there is emerging, and market design is the leading edge of this, a really different way of conceptualizing markets. So, and it has to do with conceptualizing what's a commodity at the very beginning, right? For instance, we've all grown up on, old guys like me, young guys like you, we've all grown up on supply and demand, right? What is the commodity for supply and demand? I think it's something like machine screws, right? Or pencils, things that are easily standardized, one looks just like another. The only thing to talk about is quantities, right? My dentist actually just sold his dental practice to somebody else, right? Can we imagine supply and demand curves for dental practices, right? Are any two dental practices alike? Okay. And once we start thinking about that kind of thing, right, about every commodity being different, if we think about labor markets, right, once, some markets, I suppose, are really quite standard, but many labor markets, the job specifications are not exactly the same. The kind of workers that people are looking for, not exactly the same. Again, these things can't be standardized. Once we start thinking about that, we have to rethink what our analyses look like. And what I think we've learned from somewhat from the matching literature and from some other theoretical literature having to do with things like bundling in markets and things like this, is that everything we know about welfare economics goes out the window, for instance, right? We have to rethink the whole thing. This is a tremendously exciting task. And this is just one piece of it. And when we start talking about problems, well, particular kinds of workers in labor markets, right, or particular kinds of information that people have access to, the social milieu in which all of this stuff sits, right, that's when these things come to the fore. And so I think that this is tremendously exciting. So we need, this is a bad time to say this, I know we need more theorists.
I like any stream of questioning that leads to the conclusion that there needs to be more employment for economic theorists. I support all sort of economic theorist labor programs with or without entry-level certification. But okay, so Larry's answer is the beginning of my answer to your question as well. And I can do the interactive proof that this is a part of my core beliefs because there's a slide that says it later in the deck. We really need a new way of conceiving welfare that accounts for all of these additional equity concerns. In the specific adoption context, this was actually paramount. I didn't mention it in the slide deck mostly because of time and the associated complexity, but did plan to come back to it when I talked about this. So one of the things, I think it was Hispanic students, they found that like some particular or Hispanic children, I think was the ethnic group they found was just systematically less likely to be accepted in these adoption offers. And so it was exactly the effect that you described. It was harder to place children from a particular ethnic group. And part of the underlying goal was to eliminate that particular inequality. And they found that that was a feature or a benefit feature of the exact matching, right? The takeaway for actual matching is, if you find a parent that says, we don't care what the ethnic group of the child is, you're much more, your propensity to offer them the opportunity to adopt a Hispanic child should be higher. And you can weight that in your system appropriately. There's a meta question that this does not solve. So that's the tinkering with the system solution to try and solve the problem on the ground. That doesn't do anything to address the broader problem that these preferences are formed not in a vacuum and have all sorts of social and historical baggage associated with them, and that you'd really like the market to somehow also help people. I guess I don't, as an economist, I don't exactly want to take a stand on which preferences people should or should not have, but you want to help them find a preference towards equality in a broader context. And there, you might actually imagine design solutions that do this as well, right? Once you have a system that's trying very hard to match Hispanic children, your chance of getting matched to a child goes up if you're willing to take a Hispanic child, right? So if you think about this like a tantomas process, if extra weight is being put on assigning Hispanic children to parents, then in principle, over a really long market time period, people should figure out, that if they're willing to take Hispanic children, they can match the children earlier. And so a perfect, idealized, frictionless market should eventually incorporate that information, and the parents who care more about matching to children earlier should be the ones whose preferences change first. Of course, in practice, we're not watching a multi-thousand-year adoption market, and so figuring out how to understand the correct design of a system that must be run in a static and relatively short time frame is still a hard and hopefully solvable design problem. But I think the first step towards it is to re-understand how we theorize about welfare, and then to think about what mechanism design looks like in that context. Does that help? Cool. That doesn't solve the discouraged labor, that doesn't solve the discouraged labor problem. Let me think for a second about what's generalizable from what I just said. I think actually there the answer is a pretty different type of answer. So in that context, that looks much more like the changing of preferences than the fixing of an individual market, right? Like the hope of economics. I had this fascinating discussion with somebody at the Society of Fellows who is very skeptical of economics as a discipline, and we sort of about why is it that economists like these things called markets? What is it that they are supposed to be doing? Why do we have these things? And we finally got down to this funny sort of conclusion at the end, conclusion détente, I'm not sure which was that economics has to it a fundamental optimism that that we like markets because we think they're trying to maximize efficiency, where by efficiency we really mean a shorthand for welfare. We think markets are trying to move in a way that is socially optimal. And here we mean, again, the meta market, like an individual financial market or something, might maximize sort of just transactional efficiency while creating massive inequalities in wealth. But we think that the entire world, sort of this system of incentives in which we interact, is trying to go to a place that is social welfare maximizing under some very idealized preference. It takes a long time to get there. We're not there. But so the idea of design when attacking a gigantic problem is to understand sort of as many of the design levers as possible, figure out all the ways, so to take discouraged labor, figure out all of the stages and points at which these people are becoming discouraged or unable to achieve access. To some extent, triaging, right? You could make an entire career out of just fighting this one problem, and you possibly should. I'm not attempting to suggest that you shouldn't. You could make an entire career out of fighting this one problem. Triage, figure out sort of where the barriers are the highest, and the possible benefits are also the highest. Sort of where you can actually increase welfare the most by fixing things. And you're simultaneously working not just on the margin of the individuals in the market, but also the people who orchestrate the market, the people who run the market, and the society in which the market exists. And then, you use a combination of sort of all of social science. You should really be an economist and a sociologist and, on some days possibly a social worker too, right? You should be every type of person trying to design the space better, whether it's, whether it's entry-level certification, whether it's, better after-school programs, whether it's sort of all the different things you can do to encourage and improve participation. Track and measure the effects really, really carefully. And then, and this is a thing that I haven't said anywhere else yet, but I think is truly important, share the results not just with people who understand and participate in the market, but the outside world. The way to create social change against gigantic problems is to convince lots and lots of other people. First to provide lots of other people evidence, and hopefully convince them to form opinions based on evidence. This is you should be writing columns, you should be talking to policymakers in other cities, and eventually think of as one of your goals sort of that the market of ideas, the meta market, should also eventually come to transform people's preferences to create new access. It's not a global answer, but that's at least how I think about gigantic problems. Yeah?
So in the spirit of expanding the set of goods for which we might design a market,
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could talk a bit about what you see as the interaction between rights and the operation of a market. So for instance, you alluded to Matt Desmond's work and suggested that maybe since evictions are so costly, there should be a right to housing. Or this certainly comes up in the refugee context, like the 1951 convention gives people rights against refoulement, like being turned back at the border, and not being considered for the refugee application. But you wonder about how that can operate in a market context, and I'd like to hear.
Yeah, so rights and so first of all, we should fix the definition of market. I apologize, I should have done this earlier. To me, a market is any instance in which agents interact with each other and seek to transact, where transact is a very broad definition of thing, subject to incentives that are in play. So essentially, anytime agents are interacting subject to incentives. Rights live in this fuzzy space between being a part of the market and being a precondition, sort of that defines the rules of the market. And it's often not directly the role of the market or economic designer to define those preconditions. Those are often given by society. But as we were just talking about, the way that market outcomes work give us a lever to start advocating for changes to the preconditions. And so while most of the things that we do in design live within the frame of the market, sometimes the correct thing to do is to edit the outside and structure of the frame. I think of that as like a similar exercise, and it's in the broader economic design terminology, it probably still makes sense as economic design, but it's a different type of process because you're engaging with the social preference rather than with satisfying the social preference. How should you be informed about which rights you wish to advocate for or other changes to the frame? Same way as everything else. You should understand the economics and other effects of the situation and try and figure out the socially optimal status. Yep.
I was just going to say, as far as like a right to housing, I think the vernacular gets a little bloated, right? And so I think for an economist, at least in that case, I think you can argue it either way, in that it doesn't necessarily have to be a right. You can still say we should still provide it anyway, right? So I mean, I suppose that particularly with immigrants and refugees, there might be a different discussion there. But I just think that from a practical standpoint, you can reach the same goal in a lot of these cases without having to attach this sort of external definition of right or not a right. But I think in other cases, definitely you need to address that.
Totally fair. This is a version of the wonderful paradox in economics that you can't tell the difference between a hard constraint and something that just has extremely negative utility, right? Like, a right maybe in one use of the terminology means a hard constraint. In everyone should be, housing is something to which everyone should have access. That could be inside the frame of the market with a big negative social welfare weight. Totally right. And I'm not. And you're right. I shouldn't take. I'm not informed enough to take a strong stand on which of the two which bin this one should be in. They certainly do affect differently how people think about the absence thereof.
And I think that's my point, is that sometimes the social cost of trying to redefine what is a right and what isn't is a different issue than trying to just set up a practical solution.
For sure. Totally right. Pun not originally intended. Yeah.
I was curious about the boundaries of markets, geographic or otherwise, and I get the sense that kind of everything you just said in reference to the rates question also applies to the boundaries question. So I was just curious if you agree. And if you had anything to add.
To a first order, that's right. So pun again not intended. Sorry, it's the end of the day. It's time to get punny. That's right. So the boundaries of a market are sometimes exceedingly easy to observe, and even so, there's sometimes those things we observe are not actually the boundaries, right? Boundaries of a marketplace are often very well defined. So like an online labor market is a marketplace, and we can usually see all the participants if we zoom out far enough on some big spreadsheet. The market those participants are participating in is a labor market that is global, of which this is one clearinghouse. And most of them are interacting with most of the participants interact with this clearinghouse, maybe some other online clearinghouse, and then some local labor market that doesn't intersect with the other sort of global market, labor market components. I think for the purpose of analysis, it's really important to understand sort of the relevant boundary, right? Sort of the first order boundary of the market you're studying. So you might if you were studying migrant labor in the developing world, you might study sort of the associated labor market and sort of the boundaries of travel that people travel to, and like the sort of overlapping patchwork of potential labor market paths, and you might naturally exclude the software industry in California or something like this. That's super extreme. That's almost a useless example because it's so extreme. But it does sort of illustrate the type of definition you have to do analysis. At some point, you have to be willing to take a stand on where the boundaries are. You should stress test that, right? Like often you discover that your markets behave in unusual ways or unexpected ways exactly because you've mismeasured that boundary. Conjecture in the Chicago public school match, they did an intervention that a lot of people think is confusing, but the conjectured reason for the intervention is that it's the correct intervention if you believe parents are likely to send their children to private schools if they don't get their kids into the schools they like the most.
Or move outside.
Sorry?
Or move outside of the system.
Or move outside of the system, exactly, more generally. And so there, you see things that look like sort of strange behavior. The hypotheses are, well, maybe they're confused, but they've been doing this for a long time. Is there some outside of the boundaries we've described, cause? And the answer is, yeah, quite possibly. It's thoroughly plausible what's going on is they're dealing with the fact that there's an outer school market that's adjoint to, but not actually part of the public school system. But yeah, unfortunately, this, I think, at least so far, we don't have a science of how to define. It's very case by case. Good question, and totally right. Pun, again, not intended. Further questions, queries? All right, let's see how we're doing on time. 3:55. So we have a hard stop at 4:30. We've done a lot of discussion about these different contexts. I have the following proposal, very unorthodox. So there are two more case studies queued up. One of them is about discrimination on Airbnb, and then digital divides more generally. The second is about this food bank allocation system I described. I propose to run through the digital discrimination one very quickly because it touches on a lot of the things we've already discussed in this long discussion. Talk about the food bank one in a little bit more detail, and then following a special request made earlier, I promised to give some commentary on advice for graduate school and stuff like this. And so let's dedicate 15 or so minutes at the end to that. Cool? That got the most nods of anything. Should I have upped the graduate school fraction? 20? Auction, 21? You'll hear 21. All right. Good. All right, now let's figure out why this thing's not working. There we go. All right. Unequal sharing economy. What is the story? Early stage online platforms, concealed lots of information. Now with the sharing economy, sort of made it possible to book hotels from anywhere. But now with the sharing economy, in order to encourage trust in the system, you actually have to provide a lot of information. You need to tell people, show people pictures. This is a real person who might show up to your house. They don't look suspicious. They have a photo, have a shirt with teddy bears on it. So a lot of online platforms have moved towards far more information in profiles than you might even see if you were booking a hotel in a classical context. But this creates opportunities for unequal treatment. So Edelman, Luca, and Svirsky ran a split study styled after this famous resume split study with Airbnb accounts differing by name but otherwise identical. And they found significant discrimination against guests with African-American sounding names. As I said, I'm going to go through this quickly. There's all sorts of stuff we can talk about in this slide, but I want to get you towards the intervention solution. So there are a couple sort of initial solutions thought about. The first of which is, you could just remove information. And this is what Uber does in some cities. So in some cities, drivers were noticed to be discriminating by turning down people with names that sounded like specific types of people. And so they just hid the name information for the riders. So like ironically, sometimes removing information, so long as there's enough trust in the platform, can sort of reduce discrimination. This is sort of a pretty unsatisfying solution apropos of the discussion we just had, because it gets not at all at the root cause, right? It basically says, the way to solve discrimination is by making it hard for people to discriminate. Another solution that gets a little bit closer is you could tax bias. The better version of that, I think, though, and I'll show you in a second an example, is to somehow subsidize debiasing, just like we saw in the labor market example. A parallel thing, so the Airbnb's first major reaction to this study was to develop community standards and practices saying, look, this is not okay on our platform. If we discover that you're discriminating, you will be kicked out. This has a little bit, this is better than the first one, but has a little bit of the same problem, that it doesn't, that it only changes people's underlying types and behaviors to the extent that they feel, in this weird sort of secondary way, where they don't do anything, that nothing happens to them that causes them to have less preference for discrimination, just the costs of it go up. But more along the lines of the subsidy is they could start filling in reputation information up front. Here's their non-discrimination policy. Here's a very recent experiment by, unfortunately, I'm surely going to mispronounce Kui, Li, and Zhang. Sorry, I don't know these authors, so I don't know how their names are pronounced. Where they did a version of the Palace study where they would randomly add public reviews to guests. So they in fact replicated the Edelman-Lukasz-Tversky split study. Then they did a version where they added reputation information. And they found that a public review on a guest's page mitigates the discrimination. And in particular, it makes the acceptance rate statistically indistinguishable. So it goes on sort of talking about theory to say, so this suggests that what's going on in Airbnb is some form of statistical discrimination. Again, it's not solving the underlying problem of observed discrimination, or of observed discrimination in society, but it does at least debias people on this platform, right? It has the property that in some very small microcosmic marketplace, initial information can be enough to sort of, lead people to realize that discrimination on the platform, at least, was not actually, somehow, I don't know, unless they were doing it for taste, it was not I don't even know what I'm trying to say here. It changed their strategy. Sorry, economics as a field is not good about speaking about people who have correct or incorrect strategies, like sort of socially correct and incorrect strategies. I'm trying to say that this caused people to change their strategies in a way that was more socially positive. But it still does so in a way that's doesn't feel like it convinced people that the discrimination was in some fashion wrong. If anything, but it allowed them perhaps over time to gain data that would go on to debias them, right? If you host a bunch of guests who normally you would, have a negative view of, and you get repeated positive signals, maybe eventually you debias. So I think of this as sort of like a lead intervention. It has the property that it could eventually basically turn into a subsidy that encourages people to have preferences that are less discriminatory overall. But this just creates equality of access at the first stage. Digital divides far more generally. Again, roll through these very quickly. I don't know if any of you went to Pokemon Go Fest a couple weeks ago. Sorry, you have a thing here.
Question.
Yeah.
So here we talk about somehow ex-ante discrimination.
Yeah.
It's hard to test, but there could be some ex-post discrimination with exactly giving bad reviews. And that might even be in a shared economy even worse. And
you're totally right. You're totally right. It's a great point. So here, this is correcting a form of ex-ante discrimination whereby you provide positive reviews to make people look the same, to make them look equal, identical ex-ante. You can imagine that discriminatory preferences or priors lead people to leave worse reviews for people from from backgrounds against which they discriminate, and that could create a form of ex-post discrimination, which this suggests would be really persistent. Yeah? That's true. Again, you have to hope that if the discrimination is sort of is misplaced, right? If it's a mistaken preference in some sense, then you would hope that over time that would debias and you'd solve that problem too, right? If you interact with enough guests of other types, then eventually you should like stop discriminating against them, period. But I don't know exactly how long that would take and or what the intermediate comparative static would be in the short run. Yeah, great question. That's a paper that can probably be written. I don't know that anybody's tested it. All right, digital divides quickly. You guys were all in Chicago. I don't know if any of you were here a couple weeks ago for Pokemon Go Fest. But there's all sorts of stuff that's now possible via the digital economy, but that is still leaving different parts of the country and the world behind. This one sort of sounds silly, but it's also representative of a real problem. The locations in Pokemon Go were based on some earlier game where people tagged locations on smartphones. And people more went into neighborhoods that were perceived as nice neighborhoods. More high-income people had access to smartphones. This entrenched a historical pattern of this game, years and years before this game ever came to exist, whereby all of the exciting things were going on in nice neighborhoods, and this can sort of, and this builds on itself, right? So now all the people playing Pokemon Go are hanging out predominantly in nice neighborhoods, tagging locations, and future iterations just build on it. You can have this sort of S-curve style tipping that we think about, in neighborhood change, but here now it's in the online neighborhoods as well. It's not just racial and ethnic. There are also versions of gender bias, or any individual bias type you know of, you can find also encoded in the internet through different equalities and inequalities of access. Wikipedia. And then also there's just inequality in access to digital technology. Access to the internet both in homes and on electronic devices, both within the US and worldwide, creates, again, sort of acceleration, right? If as labor markets start moving online, as housing starts moving online, all these things become things that you need digital connections to access. We can exacerbate inequality along the lines of where people do and do not have that access. All right. Now, very quickly, let me tell you about food banks, and then we'll wrap, and then we'll talk about grad school. So what's the story about Feeding America? So Feeding America is a large US nonprofit whose mission is to feed America's hungry through a nationwide network of member food banks. So it's a centralized institution that matches food to food banks. And from a first-order theory perspective, this is very easy, right? So Feeding America just wants to give food to the food bank whose need is greatest, taking account of transportation costs, spoilage, and storage, right? It's almost not worth writing a problem set about. But in practice, there are huge obstacles in identifying how much any given food bank needs a particular load of food. So what might happen? So first of all, some food banks want particularly, high quality measured as nutritional value or storage capacity food. Others are interested, at least in the short run, in maximizing quantity. They have a big influx, maybe due to some local housing market collapse, and they just need a lot of food quickly. Just learning that information is hard, right? If anybody's asked, which type of food do you want? Do you want a lot of it or do you want high quality? The answer is both. Also, and this is very important for this application, there's unobserved variation in food access outside the network. So you might be in an area where a couple of local grocery stores have partnered with you, and so you have particular supplies of whatever those grocery stores often find they're donating. And that's not observed by Feeding America. They're only fulfilling parts of these food banks' total supplies. So what's the goal? Goal one, they want to respond to idiosyncratic demand from food banks. Two, they want to do this at the same time, and here's this second part of the welfare function, right? They want to send the food to the areas of greatest need. And there's a third part, actually, which is they want to bring in more total food. So because it was hard for them to place food, they were actually often throwing it away. That's a terrible state of affairs, and if you're throwing away food, you also can't solicit as many donations as you'd like. And so a third goal is to see whether we can, by making the market more effective, make it easier to solicit donations. Pre-2005, the choice of a food bank was either to say yes or no. You would get a call saying, here's an offer, do you want it? And they would say yes or no. If the food bank refuses a lot, then this counts against the need measure as if it had been accepted. So the thing that was rationed was offers. This is very transparent. It was agreed by all the food banks to be very fair. But it's really inefficient on those dimensions we just described, right? There's no way to indicate transitory demand, and it treats all the food types equally, right? Like potato chips are the same as frozen chicken. But in order to move to a system that allows more direct expression of preferences, they need somehow for food banks to be able to express preference intensity, but they do not want to use real money, right? If your goal is to sort of treat all the food banks equally, it is emphatically not correct to say, well, why don't you just all bid in cash for the food, and we'll give the food to whoever bids the most? Because the food banks have different marginal utilities of cash, depending on their local donation infrastructure. So here's the solution. Kenneth Prendergast, here at Chicago booth, along with a team of others from the University of Chicago, designed a system with a script currency called shares that were allocated in proportion to that ex-ante assessed need. Every day, the food banks bid in the daily spot markets using these shares. And at the end of the day, all the shares that were spent are redistributed in a way that's exogenous, again, in proportion to assessed need. There's other stuff going on. There was actually credit. Small food banks could join into could union and bid together. Prices could go negative. So if there was a donation that was particularly hard to place, you could get extra shares in exchange for picking it up. You could also sell food to the system if you got a local supply shock that you didn't actually need. You got a big donation of yogurt, but your refrigerators are full. You could sell it into the system in exchange for shares to bid tomorrow. Here's a picture of what the system looks like. Again, if you're designing a system like this, you also need to be a UI designer. First of all, there's massive heterogeneity in demand for food. So it turns out that cereal is worth about 10 times as much as soda beverages. Sorry, more than 10. What was the, I can't multiply in my head. Drastically more than soda beverages. What was the comparative? I think it's up against these guys. Snacks or something like this is somewhere in the middle. Additionally, there's heterogeneity in food bank strategies. So this is average pounds per share by food bank. Some of them differentiate on taking lots and lots of quantity. Others take much smaller quantities, choosing to save their shares and bid for specific things at higher prices. So now you see differentiation by the food banks. And perhaps most exciting, and this is the third one of those design goals, is the extensive margin. So this is intake leading up to the adoption of the system, and this is post-adoption of the system. The system's right there. By liquefying the market, it becomes possible to place essentially every donation, and they're able to bring in like over 100 million pounds more food. Canis does the back of the envelope calculation. This is a gigantic amount. So this translates to feeding like somewhere between 55 and 60,000 people per day. And that's and Canis says in his wonderfully understated, as such, this represents a considerable endorsement for this market-like allocation mechanism. This is like highly non-trivial benefit of going from a market-free system to what's essentially a free market, just in a very controlled environment with a script currency designed to create equality among the participants. It's pretty cool. I promised again, this is one of the hardest ones to come up with sort of clear generality from because it's so powerful as an individual application. But there are lots of other ways to think about market design, market and marketplace design around food getting food to low-income neighborhoods and or to the homeless. A second example is Daily Table, which is a not-for-profit retail store run by the founder of Trader Joe's that works with growers, supermarkets, manufacturers, and other suppliers who donate food, and they transform it into prepared foods to sell in low-income communities with a specific goal of making the price affordable. And this is a second marketplace take on how to transform, again, or to solve, again, what should be a simple theory question, food that's not being used, getting it to people who want it. All right, so very, very quickly, let's wrap up, and then we'll talk about grad school. So market design translates economic theory and analysis into practical solutions to real-world problems. By now, hopefully, this actually sounds like something. Yeah? Cool. We've talked about 4 principal types of market design interventions. Again, this set is not exhaustive, and they are not mutually exclusive. Marketplace mechanism redesign, information provision, reshaping the extensive margin, and market creation. Lots of ways to think now as you go out and, again, this sort of, in another universe, this could be the last talk, but now this should be prospective. As you're looking at the remainder of the week, you should be thinking about how we can redesign systems to ensure equality of access or to actively correct distributional inequalities. Again, this is something that markets can do, at least sometimes. To bring people into the market to encourage participation on the extensive margin, and to help those who are already working in other contexts, think Feeding America, to do a better job at what they're already trying to do. And then here, as I said, this is sort of the big point for the future. And 5 years from now, certainly 10, I would love to be giving a version of this talk in which we actually have an answer to this. This is Larry's plea for more theorist employment. We need to understand how to incorporate everything in the world into a more correct concept of efficiency. This is where, we've started with a welfare concept that's a little bit of a kludge, and we want sort of distributional inequalities and other forms of fairness and other forms of questions of access to all live in what we talk about when we talk about making a market run better, being more efficient. And we should be designers. It's not enough to stop just at understanding how the world could run better. We should also not just talk, we should take action and go out and do it. So, you too can be a market designer. QED.